The cowboy, who hid behind the heat. The entire town of Sentinel Ridge held its breath when Mara Wells planted her boots in the dirt outside the saloon and called out to the most untouchable man in Wyoming territory. "Caleb Mercer, do you want a wife, or are you planning to spend another summer alone, pretending that solitude keeps you safe?" Her voice cut through the afternoon heat like a blade through butter. Two small children clutched her worn skirt, their wide eyes fixed on the tall cowboy who'd rejected every woman for 5 long years. The dusty street went silent. Caleb's hand froze on his horse's reins, his carefully constructed walls trembling under the weight of one fearless question. If you want to see how a broken cowboy and a bold widow shatter the loneliness that almost destroyed them both, stay until the very end. And please, hit that like button and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story of second chances travels across the world. The summer of 1872 arrived in Sentinel Ridge, Wyoming territory, like an unwelcome guest who refused to leave. Heat shimmered off the main street in waves, distorting the false-fronted buildings and making the distant mountains look like watercolor paintings, left too long in the sun. Dust coated everything: the hitching posts, the wooden sidewalks, the windows of Sherman's General Store, creating a gritty film that tasted of drought and desperation. Caleb Mercer rode into town just past noon, his bay gelding moving with the tired precision of a horse that had made this journey too many times to count. He sat tall in the saddle, his broad shoulders casting a shadow that seemed darker than the midday sun should allow. His hat brim shaded eyes the color of winter ice, and his jaw carried the permanent tension of a man who'd learned that trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. At 32, Caleb had become something of a legend in Sentinel Ridge, though not the kind most men aspired to. He was the cowboy who never smiled, never danced, never courted. He ran the Mercer Ranch with ruthless efficiency, bringing his cattle to market on schedule and his money to the bank without fail. He paid his debts, kept his word, and wanted nothing from anyone except to be left alone. The townspeople had tried, of course. In those first months after he'd arrived 5 years ago, there had been invitations to Sunday dinners, introductions to available daughters, well-meaning attempts to draw him into the social fabric of frontier life. Caleb had declined them all with the same polite distance, until eventually the invitations stopped coming and the available daughters married other men. Now, as his horse's hooves struck the hard-packed earth of Main Street, people barely looked up. Mrs. Henderson swept her porch without a second glance. Tom Bradley loaded supplies onto his wagon with only the briefest nod of acknowledgement. Even the children playing near the livery stable paid him no mind, their game of marbles too absorbing to interrupt for a man who never offered a kind word or a spare penny for candy. Caleb preferred it this way. Invisibility was safer than scrutiny. Indifference hurt less than disappointment. He tied his horse outside Sherman's General Store, the leather reins warm from the sun and his own body heat. The store's interior offered minimal relief from the oppressive temperature, a few degrees cooler perhaps, but still thick with the smell of grain sacks, tobacco, and kerosene. Vernon Sherman stood behind the counter, his shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows and sweat staining the collar of his once white shirt. "Caleb." Vernon's greeting was neutral, professional. "Got your order ready. Flour, coffee, salt, sugar. Added an extra pound of nails like you asked in your note." "Appreciated." Caleb's voice was low, roughened by years of talking more to horses than to people. He pulled folded bills from his vest pocket and counted out the exact amount, neither asking for credit nor expecting conversation. Vernon accepted the money with the practiced ease of a man who'd learned not to push. "Heard Peterson's selling his north pasture. Might be worth a look if you're thinking about expanding." Caleb gathered the supplies, his movements economical and efficient. "Not interested." "Right. Well, offer stands if you change your mind." Vernon wiped his forehead with a handkerchief that had seen better days. "This heat's got everyone on edge. Creek's running low. Cattle are stressed. Could use some rain." "Could." Caleb hoisted the flour sack over his shoulder with an ease that spoke of long-developed strength. The muscles across his back shifted beneath his faded blue shirt, and for just a moment Vernon remembered that this silent, solitary man had once been young, maybe even happy, before whatever had happened to carve the hardness into his features. Outside, Caleb loaded the supplies onto his horse, securing them with rope he'd tied and retied so many times his fingers moved without conscious thought. The sun beat down mercilessly, and he could feel sweat gathering between his shoulder blades, dampening the small of his back. He'd be glad to get back to the ranch, back to work that required only his hands and his focus, back to silence that asked nothing of him except endurance. He was reaching for his saddle horn when he heard it, a voice that cut through the afternoon torpor like a lightning strike through summer clouds. "Excuse me, are you Caleb Mercer?" The voice was female, clear, and utterly unafraid. It carried an East Coast precision that marked the speaker as educated, but there was dust on the words too, the kind that came from hard travel and harder circumstances. Caleb turned slowly, his instinct for self-protection warring with basic courtesy. What he saw made him go very still. She stood perhaps 10 feet away, this woman who dared to speak his name. She was tall for a female, maybe 5'7", with dark hair pulled back in a practical bun that had started to come loose in the heat. Her dress was brown calico, worn but clean, and cinched at a waist that suggested she'd known both plenty and scarcity in her life. But it was her face that arrested him, not beautiful in the conventional sense, but striking in its complete lack of artifice. She had strong features, intelligent brown eyes, and a mouth set in a line that suggested she'd made difficult decisions and lived with the consequences. 2 children flanked her like sentries. A boy of perhaps 7 stood to her left, skinny and sun-browned, with wary eyes that tracked every movement Caleb made. To her right, a girl of maybe 5 clung to her mother's skirt, thumb half raised toward her mouth, before some internal discipline stopped the gesture short. "I'm Mercer." His answer was automatic, his body language closed. He'd learned long ago that when strangers knew your name, they usually wanted something. The woman took a single step forward, bringing her close enough that Caleb could see the faint freckles across her nose and the determined set of her jaw. "My name is Mara Wells. These are my children, Thomas and Lucy." She didn't wait for him to acknowledge the introduction. "I've been in town for 2 days asking questions. Your name came up more than once." "That's so." It wasn't a question. Caleb's hand remained on his saddle, his entire posture suggesting he was moments away from mounting and riding off. "People say you run the most successful ranch in the territory. They say you're honest, hardworking, and completely uninterested in human companionship." Mara's tone was matter-of-fact, neither accusatory nor sympathetic. She was simply stating observations. "They also say you've rejected every woman who's ever shown interest in you, and that you plan to spend the rest of your life alone." Heat crept up Caleb's neck that had nothing to do with the summer sun. "My personal business isn't town gossip." "In a place this small, everything is gossip." Mara shifted her weight slightly, and Caleb noticed for the first time that she carried herself like someone who'd spent long hours on her feet, a washerwoman, perhaps, or a cook. "I'm not here to judge your choices, I'm here to offer you an alternative." The boy, Thomas, looked up at his mother with an expression that suggested he'd heard this speech before and didn't entirely approve. The little girl, Lucy, had her thumb all the way in her mouth now, her eyes enormous above her small fist. Caleb felt the familiar weight of unwanted attention settling over him like a too heavy coat. "Not interested, Mrs. Wells." "You haven't heard what I'm offering." "Don't need to." He gripped the saddle horn, preparing to mount. "Do you want a wife, Mr. Mercer?" Mara's voice rose just enough to carry across the street, and Caleb felt rather than saw several heads turn in their direction. "Or are you planning to spend another summer alone, pretending that solitude keeps you safe?" The words hit him like a physical blow. Caleb froze, one boot halfway to the stirrup, his entire body going rigid with shock and something darker, something that felt uncomfortably like recognition. Because she was right, wasn't she? That was exactly what he'd been doing, hiding, pretending, using isolation as armor against a world that had already hurt him more than he could bear. He turned back to face her, and for the first time in 5 years, Caleb Mercer looked directly into another person's eyes without the protective shield of indifference. "You don't know anything about me. I know loneliness when I see it." Mara didn't flinch from his stare. "I know what it looks like when someone builds walls so high they forget there was ever a door. I know because I've done it myself. The street had gone quiet. Caleb could feel eyes on them, shopkeepers in doorways, women pausing with their market baskets, men pretending to check their horses while straining to hear every word. This was exactly the kind of attention he'd spent years avoiding, the kind that led to questions and expectations, and the inevitable disappointment when he failed to be whoever they wanted him to be. This is neither the time nor the place for this conversation. His voice was low, dangerous even, but Mara didn't retreat. Then where? When? Your ranch is 12 miles outside town, and you come in once a month for supplies. You don't attend church. You don't go to the saloon, and you don't socialize. If I wait for a convenient time, I'll be waiting until winter freezes us both solid. She crossed her arms over her chest, a gesture that managed to be both defiant and oddly vulnerable. I'm a widow with 2 children and exactly $17 to my name. I came west because I was promised work that doesn't exist. I need a home, and my children need stability. You need... She paused, seemed to search for the right words. You need someone to remind you that being alive is different from just surviving. Thomas tugged on his mother's sleeve. Ma, he whispered urgently, but Mara shook her head. Not now, Thomas. Caleb looked down at the boy, really looked at him for the first time. The kid was scared, not of Caleb necessarily, but of this whole situation, of his mother's boldness, of the uncertain future that stretched ahead of them like the endless Wyoming sky. Caleb understood that fear. He'd felt it himself, in a different time, for different reasons. You're making a spectacle, Caleb said finally, though his voice had lost some of its edge. I'm making a proposal. Mara didn't budge. A practical arrangement. I can cook, clean, mend, manage a household. Thomas is old enough to help with ranch work, and Lucy is learning her letters. We're not asking for charity. We're offering partnership. Work in exchange for a home and a future that isn't spent moving from town to town, begging for scraps. And what do you think you know about ranch life? About the work it takes, the isolation, the... Caleb stopped himself, aware that his voice had risen. I grew up on a farm in Pennsylvania. I know early mornings and late nights. I know that animals don't care if you're tired or sick or heartbroken. I know that good land and hard work can build something worth having. Mara's chin lifted slightly. I also know that doing it alone is twice as hard and half as rewarding. But if you prefer your solitude, say so. We'll move on and find another way. The little girl, Lucy, chose that moment to pull her thumb from her mouth and pipe up in a voice as clear as a bell. I can feed chickens, and I know how to gather eggs without breaking them. Despite everything, the tension, the unwanted attention, the uncomfortable truth of Mara's words, Caleb felt something crack inside his chest. The child's earnestness, her small offering of usefulness, reminded him of a time when he'd believed that effort and goodness were enough to keep people safe. I don't have chickens, he said, and his voice came out rougher than he'd intended. Then maybe you should. Mara's expression softened infinitesimally. Chickens are practical. They provide eggs, meat, and a reason to walk outside every morning. Small things to care for, good for the soul. Caleb wanted to argue that he didn't need anything good for his soul, that his soul was doing just fine, starved and neglected in the corner where he'd left it 5 years ago. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, he found himself looking at this strange woman and her dusty children standing in the middle of Main Street with nothing but courage and $17, asking him to consider a different kind of life. This is insane, he said, but it sounded less like a rejection and more like an observation. Probably, Mara agreed. But I've learned that desperate times don't leave room for sensible choices. I'm asking for a chance, Mr. Mercer. 30 days. Let us stay at your ranch. Let me prove what I can contribute. And if at the end of that time you're not satisfied, we'll leave with no hard feelings and whatever wages you think fair for the work done. Ma, Thomas tried again, his face creased with worry. It's all right, Thomas. Mara put her hand on her son's shoulder, and the gesture was so protective, so full of fierce love that Caleb had to look away. The sun beat down. Sweat trickled down Caleb's spine. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked, and someone laughed. Normal sounds of a normal day in a normal town. But nothing about this moment felt normal. Nothing about the choice being offered to him felt safe or sensible or remotely wise. He should say no. Every instinct he'd honed over 5 years of careful isolation screamed at him to refuse, to mount his horse and ride back to the ranch where silence was his only companion and heartbreak couldn't reach him because he'd stopped allowing anything to matter enough to break him. But there was Lucy's small voice talking about feeding chickens, and Thomas's scared, brave face, and Mara's unflinching honesty about loneliness and walls and doors he'd forgotten existed. There was the uncomfortable recognition that she was right. He wasn't living, he was surviving, and there was a difference that got harder to ignore with every summer that burned away another year of his life. 30 days, Caleb heard himself say, the words coming from somewhere beyond his conscious decision-making. Trial period. You cook, clean, and help maintain the house. The boy can learn ranch work if he's willing. No promises beyond a month's wages and a roof over your heads. Mara's face transformed, not quite a smile, but a visible loosening of tension that made her look younger, less hardened by whatever circumstances had brought her to this dusty street corner. Thank you, Mr. Mercer. You won't regret— Don't. He cut her off sharply. Don't make promises about what I will or won't regret. Just do the work, and we'll see how it goes. Fair enough? Mara extended her hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Caleb shook it. Her palm was rough with calluses, her grip firm and businesslike. When do we start? Now, I suppose, if you're ready. Your belongings? 2 carpet bags at the boarding house. Won't take but a minute to collect them. Caleb nodded once, already regretting every decision that had led to this moment. Meet me at the livery in 10 minutes. We'll need to rent a wagon for the ride out. Mara gathered her children and turned to go, then paused and looked back. Mr. Mercer? I meant what I said. About partnership. I'm not looking for rescue or romance or any of the things widows are supposed to want. I'm looking for honest work and a stable home for my children. Nothing more, nothing less. Good, Caleb said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. Because that's all I'm offering. He watched her walk away, her children close at her sides, and tried to ignore the voice in his head that whispered he'd just made the biggest mistake of his carefully controlled life. But it was too late now. The agreement was made, the handshake exchanged, and Caleb Mercer, the man who'd spent 5 years building walls between himself and the rest of humanity, was about to bring 3 strangers into the one place he'd considered truly safe. The ride to the ranch took nearly 3 hours in the rented wagon, and Caleb spent most of it regretting his decision. Mara sat beside him on the bench seat, her children in the back with their meager belongings, and nobody spoke except for the occasional necessary exchange about the road, or the heat, or the distance remaining. The landscape rolled past in shades of brown and gold, grassland stretching to distant mountains, occasional stands of cottonwood marking where water ran, rock formations jutting up like ancient monuments to patience and perseverance. It was beautiful in its starkness, this Wyoming territory, but it was also unforgiving. Caleb had seen more than one family break against its hardness, pack up their dreams and head back east with their tails between their legs. He glanced sideways at Mara, noting the way she sat straight back despite the wagon's jolting, the way her eyes scanned the horizon with something that looked like assessment rather than fear. Maybe she'd make it. Maybe she wouldn't. Either way, it was 30 days, and then they'd part ways, and his life would return to the familiar rhythm of solitude and work. The ranch appeared gradually as they crested a low rise, first the fencing, then the barn and outbuildings, and finally the house itself. It was a simple structure, built from logs and chinked with mud, with a stone chimney on one end and a covered porch running along the front. Caleb had built it himself in his first year here, and while it wasn't fancy, it was solid. It had weathered 5 winters and 5 summers without complaint, which was more than could be said for most things in his life. It's lovely, Mara said, and Caleb nearly laughed at the absurdity of the word. Lovely. The house was functional, practical. It kept out the wind and the rain and provided basic shelter. But lovely? That required a perspective he didn't possess. It's adequate, he corrected, pulling the wagon to a stop near the porch. 2 bedrooms, main room, kitchen area. Wells out back, pump works, but you have to prime it sometimes. Barn's there, workshop beyond it, privy's behind the house. Thomas had climbed down from the wagon and was staring around with wide eyes that held equal parts curiosity and apprehension. Lucy clung to her mother's hand, suddenly shy in this new place, with its unfamiliar smells and sounds. Caleb carried their bags inside, while Mara and the children followed. The house was dim after the bright sunlight, and it smelled of dust and male habitation, leather and tobacco, and the faint mustiness of a place that didn't get aired out enough. He set the bags down in the main room and turned to find Mara already assessing the space with a critical eye. "I'll take the spare room," she said, pointing to the smaller of the two bedroom doors. "Thomas and Lucy can share with me for now. You'll want privacy in your own space." "Fine." Caleb moved toward the kitchen, suddenly desperate for something to do with his hands. "I usually eat simple. Beans, bacon, bread when I bother to make it. Coffee's in the tin there." "I'll prepare supper," Mara said, already removing her bonnet and rolling up her sleeves. "Thomas, take Lucy and your bags to our room. Then fetch water from the well. Your mother will need it for cooking." The boy nodded and obeyed without argument, which surprised Caleb. He'd expected whining or at least questions, but Thomas seemed to understand that this was work time, not playtime, and acted accordingly. "He's a good boy," Caleb observed, and Mara's face softened with pride. "He's had to grow up fast. Lost his father 2 years ago, and we've been on the move ever since, but yes, he's good, kind-hearted and responsible beyond his years." How'd his father die? The question was out before Caleb could stop it, and he immediately regretted the intrusion, but Mara answered without hesitation. "Influenza. Took him in 3 days. One morning he was fine. By the weekend we were burying him." Her voice was matter-of-fact, but Caleb heard the old grief underneath. "Left us with debts we couldn't pay, and a landlord who wasn't interested in our sad story. We've been moving ever since, me taking work where I could find it, trying to give my children some semblance of stability. And you came all the way to Wyoming Territory because I saw an advertisement in a Philadelphia newspaper. Said there was work out here for women willing to cook and clean. Said housing was provided. When I arrived, I learned the housing was a tent camp, and the work was less than respectable." Her jaw tightened. "So I came to Sentinel Ridge instead and started asking questions. Your name came up as someone reliable, honest, and notably unattached." Caleb felt heat rise in his face again. "People talk too much. People talk exactly enough when you're trying to find a safe place for your children." Mara crossed to the kitchen area and began examining the sparse supplies. "I'll make do with what's here tonight, but we'll need to plan better meals going forward. Growing children need proper nutrition, and ranch work burns energy fast." "I can get supplies when needed," Caleb said, feeling oddly defensive about his bachelor provisions. "Never claimed to be a cook." "No judgment intended." Mara's tone remained professional, businesslike. "I'm simply assessing what we have to work with." Thomas returned with a full bucket of water, his thin arms straining with the weight, but his face set with determination. Lucy trailed behind him, having apparently decided that following her brother was safer than exploring on her own. Caleb watched them for a moment. This small family navigating a new space, trying to find their footing, and felt the unfamiliar weight of responsibility settle over him. He'd agreed to 30 days. 30 days of shared space, shared meals, shared existence. It felt simultaneously too long and not long enough. "I have work to finish before dark," he announced, already moving toward the door. "Call me when supper's ready." Outside, the late afternoon sun painted everything in shades of amber and gold. Caleb walked to the barn with long strides, seeking the familiar comfort of animal companionship and physical labor. His horse needed tending, the stalls needed mucking, and there were a dozen other tasks that demanded attention. But as he worked, he couldn't quite shake the awareness that his house was no longer empty. He could hear faint sounds drifting through the open windows. Mara moving around the kitchen, water being poured, quiet instructions given to the children. Normal sounds. Domestic sounds. The kind of sounds he'd convinced himself he didn't need or want. An hour later, Lucy's small voice called from the porch. "Mr. Caleb, Mama says supper's ready." He cleaned up at the pump, scrubbing the day's sweat and grime from his hands and face, then walked slowly back to the house. The smell hit him before he even reached the door. Real cooking, not just beans heated over a fire. Something with onions and herbs, bread baking, coffee that actually smelled rich instead of burned. Inside, the table was set with his mismatched plates and the single tablecloth he owned but never used. Mara stood at the stove, dishing out what looked like a proper stew. Thomas and Lucy sat at the table, hands folded, waiting with the practiced patience of children who'd learned that meals weren't guaranteed and gratitude was expected. "Sit," Mara directed, and Caleb obeyed without thinking. She placed a full plate before him, stew thick with vegetables he didn't remember buying, bread still warm from the oven, a cup of coffee that looked like it had been brewed with actual care. "I found carrots and potatoes in your root cellar," Mara explained as she served the children. "The bacon and beans you had I turned into something more substantial. Hope that's acceptable." Caleb picked up his fork and took a bite. The flavors, salt and pepper, herbs he couldn't name, the richness of properly cooked meat, exploded across his tongue. He couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten food that tasted like this, food that tasted like someone cared whether it nourished or just filled. "It's good," he said, and Mara's shoulders relaxed slightly. "I'm glad." She sat down with her own plate, and for a few minutes there was only the sound of eating, spoons against bowls, quiet chewing, the occasional satisfied sigh from Lucy. Then Thomas spoke up, his young voice careful and polite. "Mr. Mercer, sir? Is it all right if I ask about the ranch? About what you do here?" Caleb looked at the boy, seeing genuine curiosity rather than idle chatter. "Cattle, mostly. About 200 head grazing the north pasture. Few horses for working and riding. Grow some hay for winter feed." 200 cattle. Thomas's eyes widened. "That's a lot to manage alone." "It is," Caleb admitted. "Some things don't get done as thorough as they should. That's the trade-off for working solo." "I could help, Thomas offered tentatively. "I'm stronger than I look, and I learn fast. Pa taught me about animals before he died. How to read them. How to move around them safe." Caleb studied the boy. Skinny arms, earnest face, the desperate need to prove himself useful. He'd seen that expression before, in a mirror, a lifetime ago, when he'd been young and eager and convinced that hard work could solve any problem. "We'll see," Caleb said, which wasn't a yes, but wasn't a no either. "Ranch work's dangerous if you don't know what you're doing. Can't have you getting hurt on my watch." "I'll be careful," Thomas promised. "Real careful." Lucy, meanwhile, had finished her stew and was staring at Caleb with the unabashed curiosity of a 5-year-old. "Do you have any animals besides cows and horses?" she asked suddenly. "No," Caleb said. "Not even chickens?" Lucy's disappointment was palpable. "I told you before, no chickens." "But chickens are useful," Lucy insisted, clearly warming to her topic. "They make eggs for breakfast and they eat bugs, and they're soft when you hold them. Mrs. Patterson down the street in Philadelphia let me hold her chicken once, and it was the best thing ever." Despite himself, Caleb felt his mouth twitch. Not quite a smile, but close. "Chickens require a coop and feed and daily care." "I could do the daily care," Lucy said with absolute confidence. "I'm very responsible." "Lucy," Mara said gently, "that's enough. Mr. Mercer's ranch, Mr. Mercer's decisions." "But Mama, enough!" Lucy subsided, but Caleb could see her brain working behind those big eyes, probably planning her next campaign for chickens. The thought that this small child felt comfortable enough to argue with him about poultry after knowing him for less than a day was both alarming and oddly endearing. After supper, Mara cleaned up while Caleb retreated to the porch, ostensibly to check the horizon for weather, but really to give himself space to process the strangeness of the evening. The sun was setting in spectacular fashion, painting the sky in oranges and purples that would have been beautiful if Caleb had allowed himself to notice such things. He heard the screen door open and Mara stepped out, drying her hands on a towel. She stood beside him, not too close but near enough for conversation. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for giving us this chance." "Don't thank me yet," Caleb replied. 30 days is a long time. You might decide ranch life isn't for you. And you might decide we're more trouble than we're worth." Mara's tone held no bitterness, just pragmatic acknowledgement. "Either way, we'll give it our honest best." They stood in silence for a while, watching the light fade and the first stars appear. Caleb was acutely aware of her presence, the sound of her breathing, the faint scent of cooking that clung to her dress, the solid reality of another human being sharing his space. "I have rules," he said finally. "No going through my personal belongings. No questions about my past. You do your work, I do mine, and we maintain clear boundaries." "Understood." Mara paused, then added, "I have a rule too, respect. For me and for my children. We're here to work and build a future, not to be treated as charity cases or lesser beings." "Fair enough." Another silence, this one less awkward than companionable. Caleb wondered how that had happened so fast, this easing into shared space with a stranger. Then he remembered, she wasn't really a stranger. She was a woman who'd looked at him in the middle of Main Street and seen past the walls he'd built, who'd recognized loneliness because she carried her own. "I should get the children to bed," Mara said eventually. "Early start tomorrow?" "Sunup," Caleb confirmed. "Ranch doesn't run on town time." "We'll be ready." Mara turned to go, then hesitated. "Mr. Mercer? One more thing. I meant what I said earlier. I'm not here for romance or rescue. But I also want you to know my children are good people, kind and honest and trying their best. Whatever you think of me, please remember that about them." Before Caleb could respond, she'd slipped back inside, leaving him alone with the darkening sky and the uncomfortable realization that this arrangement, this 30-day trial, had already become more complicated than he'd intended. Inside the small bedroom, Mara tucked her children into the single bed they would share, their bodies curled together like puppies seeking warmth despite the lingering heat of the day. Thomas's eyes were already heavy with exhaustion, but Lucy fought sleep with the determination of a child who feared missing something important. "Mama," Lucy whispered, her small hand clutching the worn quilt. "Is this our home now?" Mara smoothed the hair back from her daughter's forehead, her touch gentle despite the calluses that marked years of hard work. "For 30 days, yes. After that, we'll see." "I like it here," Lucy murmured, her eyelids finally surrendering. "It's quiet, and Mr. Caleb has a nice face when he's not frowning." Thomas snorted softly. "He's always frowning, Lucy." "No," Lucy insisted with the absolute certainty of childhood. "Sometimes his eyes go soft, like he wants to smile but forgot how." Mara felt something twist in her chest, half hope, half warning. Her daughter saw goodness too easily, trusted too quickly. It was a beautiful quality and a dangerous one in a world that didn't always reward faith with kindness. But maybe, just this once, Lucy's instincts were right. Maybe beneath Caleb Mercer's frozen exterior, there was still a man capable of warmth. Or maybe Mara was projecting her own desperate need for this arrangement to work into wishful thinking about a stranger's capacity for change. She waited until both children were deeply asleep before allowing herself to truly look at the room that would be theirs. It was sparse, rough wooden walls, a single window with faded curtains, the bed, and one small dresser. But it was clean and solid, and the roof didn't leak. After 2 years of boarding houses, charity cots, and one terrible week sleeping in a church basement, this felt like luxury. Mara changed into her nightdress and lay down on the narrow strip of mattress her children's sprawled bodies left available. Through the thin wall, she could hear Caleb moving in the next room. Boots hitting the floor, the creak of bed springs, the settling sounds of a man preparing for sleep. The proximity was oddly intimate, sharing wall space with a man she'd met only hours ago. She thought about her boldness in town, the way she'd called out his name in the middle of Main Street with half of Sentinel Ridge watching. It had been a calculated risk born of absolute desperation. She'd spent her last $17 on room and board, and the boarding house owner had made it clear that come tomorrow, she and her children would be on the street. Mara had learned long ago that propriety was a luxury afforded to women with options. She had none, so she'd asked around, gathering information with the systematic determination of someone who understood that knowledge was survival. And every conversation had eventually circled back to the same man, Caleb Mercer, successful rancher, completely solitary, utterly unapproachable. The women had spoken of him with a mixture of frustration and grudging respect. The men had mentioned his work ethic with the kind of admiration reserved for those who succeeded without asking for help. And Mara had thought, here is a man who has built walls so high he's trapped himself inside them. Here is someone who might understand that sometimes partnerships of convenience are more honest than romantic fairy tales. She'd been right. He'd said yes. Now came the hard part, proving that she and her children were worth keeping. Morning arrived with the apologetic gray light of pre-dawn, and Mara woke to the sound of Caleb already moving through the house. She dressed quickly and quietly, leaving her children sleeping, and emerged to find him at the kitchen pump, filling the coffee pot with brisk efficiency. "Didn't mean to wake you," he said without looking up, his voice gravelly with sleep. "You didn't. I'm an early riser by habit." Mara moved to the stove, assessing what needed to be done. "I'll have breakfast ready in 30 minutes. I usually just grab coffee and jerky." "That's not a breakfast, that's an apology to your stomach." Mara began pulling ingredients from the meager supplies. "You're doing physical labor all day. You need real food." Caleb opened his mouth as if to argue, then seemed to think better of it. He poured himself coffee and retreated to the porch, leaving Mara to work in the quiet kitchen as dawn slowly brightened the windows. She made pancakes from scratch, using the last of the flour and some buttermilk she'd found in the cold storage. Bacon sizzled in the pan, filling the house with a smell that eventually drew both children from their bed and Caleb back from whatever morning inspection he'd been conducting outside. They ate together as the sun crested the horizon, painting the ranch in shades of gold and amber. Thomas asked careful questions about the day's work, and Caleb answered with the patience of a man who appreciated genuine interest. Lucy announced that she'd dreamed about chickens, which earned her an amused glance from her brother, and the faintest quirk of Caleb's mouth that might, in someone else, have been called a smile. After breakfast, Caleb looked at Thomas with an assessing gaze that made the boy sit straighter. "You meant what you said about wanting to help?" "Yes, sir." "Then come with me. We'll start with basic ranch maintenance, mending fence, checking water troughs. You pay attention, follow instructions, and speak up if something seems dangerous. Understood?" Thomas's face lit up with an eagerness that made Mara's heart ache. Her son had been trying so hard to be the man of the family, carrying burdens no 7-year-old should bear. Maybe here, under Caleb's gruff guidance, he could learn to be both helpful and still a child. "What about me?" Lucy asked, her lower lip trembling slightly at the prospect of being left behind. Caleb looked at the little girl with something approaching discomfort. He clearly had no idea what to do with a 5-year-old, and Mara was about to suggest Lucy stay with her when Caleb spoke. "Can you count?" Lucy nodded vigorously. "All the way to 50. Then you can help me count fence posts that need replacing. I'll point, you count, and we'll keep track together. But you have to stay close to your mother and not wander. Ranch has hazards for small people who don't pay attention." "I'll pay very good attention," Lucy promised solemnly. So they set out together, an odd quartet moving across the ranch as the morning heat began its daily assault. Caleb led them to the northern fence line, where weathered posts marked the boundary between his land and open range. Mara walked beside her children, carrying water and supplies, while Caleb moved with the economical grace of someone who knew every inch of his property. Thomas watched everything with hungry attention, absorbing information about post depth, wire tension, and the importance of maintaining clear boundaries. Lucy counted diligently, announcing each damaged post with theatrical importance. And Caleb, despite his obvious discomfort with the invasion of his solitary routine, proved to be a patient teacher. "Why's this post rotted and that one's fine?" Thomas asked, pointing to 2 sections of fence. "Water drainage," Caleb explained, crouching to show the boy how ground slope affected wood deterioration. "See how the land dips here? Water pools after rain, keeps the wood wet, encourages rot. Over there the ground's higher, stays drier. Got to account for terrain when you build, or you'll be rebuilding every few years." "Pa used to say the land talks if you know how to listen," Thomas offered quietly. Caleb glanced at the boy, and something flickered across his face. Recognition, perhaps, or old grief. "Your pa was right. Smart men learn the land's language. Fools try to force it to speak theirs." They worked through the morning, Caleb and Thomas replacing posts while Mara and Lucy cleared debris and prepared materials. The sun climbed higher, turning the air thick and oppressive, but nobody complained. This was the test period, and all 4 of them understood that every action was being evaluated. By midday, the heat became dangerous. Caleb called a halt, leading them to a stand of cottonwoods near a small creek that cut through his property. The shade was immediate relief, and the sound of running water made the temperature feel almost bearable. 15 minutes, Caleb announced, settling onto a large rock and removing his hat to wipe the sweat from his forehead. Then we head back to the house for midday meal and rest. Afternoon work starts at 3 when the worst heat passes. Mara distributed water from the canteen, making sure the children drank before she allowed herself a sip. Lucy immediately kicked off her shoes and waded into the shallow creek, squealing with delight at the cool water. Thomas hesitated, looking to Caleb for permission. "Go on," Caleb said gruffly. "Just watch for drop-offs. Creek's shallow here, but gets deeper downstream." Thomas joined his sister, and for a few moments there was only the sound of children playing, splashing, laughing, being young in the way they rarely got to be anymore. Mara found herself watching Caleb watch them, trying to read the expression on his weathered face. "They're good workers," he said finally, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "The boy's got good instincts. Ask smart questions." "He's been trying to fill his father's shoes," Mara replied. "I keep telling him he's allowed to just be a child, but he doesn't listen. Maybe he needs to work before he can play. Some people are built that way. Got to earn rest before they can enjoy it." Caleb's gaze remained on the children, but Mara sensed he was talking about himself as much as Thomas. "And some people forget that rest isn't something you earn," Mara said carefully. "It's something you need to keep functioning." Caleb turned to look at her then, really look at her, and Mara saw layers of exhaustion beneath the hard exterior. This was a man who'd been running on empty for a long time, burning himself down to nothing in the name of self-sufficiency. "How long since you took a full day off?" she asked. "Don't need days off. Work doesn't stop because I'm tired." "Work doesn't stop, but you will if you push too hard for too long. That's basic sense, not weakness." "You've known me one day and you're already trying to manage my life?" There was an edge to Caleb's voice, but Mara didn't back down. "I'm trying to understand the man whose household I'm running. Can't keep a house properly if I don't know the rhythms and needs of the people in it." They stared at each other for a long moment, some kind of silent negotiation happening in the space between words. Finally, Caleb looked away first, his jaw tight, but his posture fractionally less defensive. "I don't sleep well," he admitted, the words seemingly pulled from him against his will. "Haven't in years, nightmares. So I work instead. Easier than lying in the dark." Mara absorbed this information, filing it away with all the other small pieces of Caleb Mercer she was collecting. "Nightmares about what?" "Things I'm not discussing." The wall came back up immediately, absolute and impenetrable. "Fair enough. But if working yourself to exhaustion is your way of coping, you should know it's not sustainable. Eventually your body will make the choice, your mind won't." "Noted." Caleb stood abruptly, signaling that the conversation was over. Time to head back. The afternoon followed the pattern of the morning. Work, careful instruction, the slow building of routine. Caleb showed Thomas how to check water troughs for contamination, how to read cattle behavior for signs of illness, how to move around the animals without spooking them. Lucy appointed herself official water bearer, taking her job with deadly seriousness. And Mara observed it all, taking mental notes on how to make this arrangement work. She saw that Caleb responded better to directness than flattery, that he valued competence over conversation, that he was most at ease when focused on specific tasks rather than forced into social interaction. She also saw the moments when his guard dropped, when Thomas asked a particularly insightful question and Caleb's response was almost warm, or when Lucy tripped and scraped her knee and his hand automatically reached out to steady her before he seemed to remember himself and pulled back. Dinner that evening was beef stew made from the previous night's leftovers served with fresh bread Mara had managed to bake in the ancient oven. They ate in the kind of exhausted silence that comes after a full day's work, but it was a comfortable silence now, earned through shared labor. "Tomorrow," Caleb said as he pushed back his empty plate, "I need to ride to the north pasture to check on the cattle. It's an all-day trip. You'll be here alone with the children." "We'll manage," Mara assured him. "I noticed the chicken coop behind the barn is empty but structurally sound. With your permission, I'd like to clean it out tomorrow. If we're going to be here 30 days, fresh eggs would be good for everyone." "Don't have money to spare for chickens right now." "No need. I saw a notice at the general store. Mrs. Patterson has pullets she's trying to sell. I could trade work for a few hens, mending, washing, whatever she needs. Then the coop would be ready when you decide the time's right. Caleb studied her with that penetrating gaze that seemed to see straight through whatever facade a person might present. You're awfully confident I'm going to decide chickens are a good idea. I'm confident that Lucy won't stop campaigning until you do, Mara replied with the faintest smile. Better to be prepared. 1740, Lucy piped up from across the table. That's how many fence posts need replacing. I counted very carefully. You did, Caleb acknowledged, and again there was that almost smile, the brief softening that Lucy had noticed. Good job. Lucy beamed as if she'd been awarded a medal, and Thomas looked at his sister with the tolerant affection of an older sibling who secretly admired his younger sister's fearlessness. After the children were asleep, Mara found Caleb on the porch again, apparently a nightly ritual. She joined him without asking permission, sensing that their evening conversations were becoming their own kind of routine. Your son has a good head for ranching, Caleb said into the darkness. If you stay beyond the 30 days, I could teach him properly. Might give him a trade that'll serve him his whole life. The casual way he mentioned them staying made Mara's heart skip. You're already thinking beyond the trial period? I'm thinking practically. Boy that age, he learns fast or he learns wrong, and wrong habits are hard to break. If he's going to be here, might as well teach him right. Caleb shifted his weight, and Mara heard the wicker chair creak. Doesn't mean I've decided anything. Just means I'm not fool enough to waste teaching opportunities. Of course, Mara agreed, hiding her small surge of hope. Purely practical. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the night sounds, crickets chirping, distant cattle lowing, the whisper of wind through dry grass. The stars were spectacular out here, away from any town lights, scattered across the sky like spilled diamonds. Can I ask you something? Mara ventured. And you can tell me it's none of my business if you want. Go ahead. Why did you say yes? To us, I mean. You could have refused in town, ridden away, kept your solitary life exactly as it was. Why didn't you? Caleb was quiet for so long that Mara thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, just when she'd decided to retract the question, he spoke. Because you were right. About the hiding, the pretending that loneliness is safety. His voice was low, rough, with something that might have been shame or might have been grief. And because your daughter said she could feed chickens without breaking eggs, and it was such a small, specific claim of competence that it reminded me of something. What? That people used to make those kinds of claims to me. Small promises about small things, and I used to believe them. He paused. Before I learned that promises break easier than eggs. Mara absorbed this, understanding that she'd just been given a piece of truth that Caleb rarely shared. I can't promise we won't disappoint you, she said carefully, but I can promise we'll try our hardest not to. That's all anyone can promise, Caleb replied. The trying. The rest is just hoping things work out despite our best efforts to ruin them. It wasn't optimistic, but it was honest, and Mara found she preferred his rough honesty to empty reassurances. They sat together until the temperature finally dropped enough to make sleep possible, then parted with quiet good nights, each retreating to their separate rooms and separate thoughts. The next morning, Caleb left before dawn, his saddlebags packed with supplies for a day-long ride. Mara watched from the kitchen window as he rode north, his silhouette gradually disappearing into the gray pre-dawn light. Then she turned to her children and smiled. Today, we make this house truly livable. They worked with systematic efficiency. Thomas helped Mara beat the dust from curtains and rugs, while Lucy swept with a broom nearly as tall as she was. They scrubbed floors until the wood gleamed, washed windows until the glass was transparent, and organized supplies with the kind of order that made daily living easier. By mid-morning, Mara tackled the chicken coop. It was indeed structurally sound, just neglected, filled with old straw, cobwebs, and the accumulated debris of years. She and Thomas hauled out the debris, while Lucy discovered a family of field mice in one corner and insisted on relocating them humanely to the barn. Mice eat chicken feed, Thomas pointed out. But these are babies, Lucy protested, cradling a nest of tiny, pink, squirming creatures. They didn't know they were trespassing. Lucy, Mara started, then stopped. Her daughter's fierce protection of small, helpless things was admirable even when impractical. All right, but they go to the far corner of the barn, away from any future feed storage. Lucy carried out her mission with reverent care, returning to announce that the mice were safely relocated, and she'd said a little prayer for their continued survival. By noon, the coop was clean, the nesting boxes repaired, and the small fenced yard cleared of anything that might harm future chickens. Mara stood back, assessing their work with satisfaction. It was ready. Now they just needed to convince Caleb that chickens were worth having. The afternoon heat drove them inside, where Mara used the time to inventory supplies and plan meals. She found Caleb's record book in a drawer, neat columns tracking cattle sales, supply purchases, and expenses. His handwriting was precise, almost architectural, and the numbers told the story of a man who lived well within his means and saved methodically. She also found, tucked in the back of the book, a small daguerreotype photograph. A young woman with soft features and hopeful eyes, her hand resting on the arm of a younger, smiling version of Caleb Mercer. The inscription on the back read, "Sarah and Caleb, May 1867. Mara stared at the photograph for a long moment, pieces clicking into place. Sarah. The past Caleb refused to discuss, the nightmares that kept him working instead of sleeping. The walls built so high that 5 years of solitude hadn't been enough to lower them. She carefully replaced the photograph exactly as she'd found it, saying nothing to the children. Everyone was entitled to their private griefs, and she wouldn't violate his by prying into pain he clearly wasn't ready to share. Caleb returned just before sunset, looking dusty and tired but satisfied. "Cattle look good," he reported as he dismounted. "No signs of illness, plenty of grays left despite the heat." "Supper's ready when you are," Mara told him, "and we've made some improvements to the house. I hope you don't mind." She watched his face as he entered the house, saw the way his eyes widened slightly at the transformation. Everything was clean, organized, welcoming in a way it hadn't been since whenever Sarah had last lived here, Mara guessed. "You didn't have to, Caleb started, then stopped, seeming to lose the words. "We did, though," Mara said gently. "We're living here too, at least for now. Might as well make it comfortable for everyone." Over dinner, Lucy launched her campaign. "Mr. Caleb, the chicken coop is all clean now, very clean. Perfect for chickens if someone happened to have chickens, which we don't, but if we did, they would be very happy there." "Lucy," Thomas hissed, but Caleb held up a hand. "Let her finish." Lucy took a deep breath, clearly recognizing her moment. "Mrs. Patterson has 6 pullets she wants to sell, and Mama says she could trade work for them, so they wouldn't cost you any money. And chickens make eggs, which are good for breakfast, and they eat bugs, which are bad for gardens, and they're very easy to take care of if someone is responsible and counts carefully and doesn't break eggs." "I see." Caleb's expression remained neutral, but Mara caught the slight quirk at the corner of his mouth. And who would be this responsible person taking care of these theoretical chickens? "Me?" Lucy's hand shot up as if she was in a schoolroom. "I would feed them and water them and collect eggs and tell them stories so they don't get lonely." "Chickens don't need stories," Thomas interjected. "Everything needs stories," Lucy insisted. "Stories make the world less scary." Caleb looked at Lucy with an expression that Mara couldn't quite read. Then he turned to Mara. "You really want to trade your labor for chickens?" "I really want fresh eggs and a purpose for that clean coop," Mara replied. "And yes, I'm willing to work for it." "Fine." Caleb's decision was abrupt, final. "You can get the chickens, but Lucy's responsible for their daily care, and if they die from neglect, we don't replace them." Lucy launched herself from her chair and threw her arms around Caleb's waist before anyone could stop her. "Thank you, thank you, thank you. I'll take the best care of them ever. They'll be the happiest chickens in all of Wyoming." Caleb went completely rigid, his hands hovering in the air as if he didn't know what to do with them. Mara was about to intervene, to pull her daughter back and remind her about boundaries, when Caleb slowly, carefully, placed one large hand on Lucy's head in an awkward but genuine pat. "All right then," he said gruffly. "That's enough excitement for one evening." Lucy released him and bounded back to her seat, chattering happily about chicken names and coop decoration. Thomas caught his mother's eye and smiled, a small, knowing smile that said he understood the significance of what had just happened. Caleb Mercer, the man who'd built walls to keep everyone out, had just allowed a 5-year-old girl to breach them with nothing more than enthusiasm and a sincere promise about egg care. Later that night, after the children were asleep and the house had settled into quiet, Mara found Caleb examining the clean chicken coop by lantern light. She approached slowly, not wanting to startle him. "It's good work," he said without turning around. "Better than I would have done. Thomas helped. He's strong for his age. He's a good boy. They both are." Caleb set the lantern on a post and finally looked at her. "I found the photograph back where it belongs. You looked at it." It wasn't a question. Mara nodded. "I did. I'm sorry. I was inventorying supplies and found it accidentally." "Sarah," Caleb said, and just speaking the name seemed to cost him something. "We were married 6 months. She died of fever the winter after we built this house. 22 years old, buried in ground so frozen we had to wait 3 days for it to thaw enough to dig." "I'm sorry," Mara said softly, because what else was there to say? "I blame myself. Brought her out here to the middle of nowhere, away from doctors and family, and when she got sick there was nothing I could do except watch her slip away." His voice was flat, emotionless, but Mara heard the ocean of pain beneath the careful control. "Promised myself I'd never put myself in that position again, never care enough for someone that losing them could destroy me. And you've kept that promise for 5 years. Until 3 strangers showed up in town and asked me to reconsider." Caleb turned to face her fully. "I want you to understand something, Mara. I agreed to 30 days because you were right. I've been hiding. But that doesn't mean I'm ready to stop hiding. Doesn't mean I'm capable of being whatever you or your children might need me to be." "We're not asking you to be anything except honest," Mara replied. "We're not here to fix you or save you or replace what you lost. We're here because we need a home and you need help, and maybe, just maybe, we can build something practical out of mutual necessity." "Nothing more?" "Nothing more than what naturally develops," Mara said carefully. "But I won't lie and say I don't hope that maybe, over time, this house could feel less like a monument to loss and more like a place where life happens again." Caleb was quiet for a long time, his face half-shadowed by the lantern light. Finally, he nodded once. 30 days. We'll see what develops." 30 days, Mara agreed. They walked back to the house together, and Mara thought about how far they'd come in just 2 days. From strangers in a dusty street to people who'd shared work, meals, and the beginning of something that might eventually resemble trust. It wasn't much, but it was more than either of them had expected. And in the morning, she would take Lucy to town to get chickens, and Thomas would learn more about cattle management, and Caleb would continue his slow, reluctant journey back toward the possibility of connection. The summer heat would press down on them all, relentless and demanding, but they would work through it together. Small things. Daily things. The kind of unremarkable moments that, accumulated over time, might add up to something worth keeping. The chickens arrived on the 4th day, 6 rust-colored pullets that Lucy immediately named after virtues she'd learned from a storybook: hope, faith, charity, grace, patience, and mercy. Mrs. Patterson had been more than willing to trade the birds for a week's worth of mending and laundry work, and Mara had spent her evenings fulfilling that bargain with needle and washboard while her children slept. Lucy took to her new responsibilities with a seriousness that would have been comical if it hadn't been so earnest. She woke before dawn without prompting, carefully measuring feed and checking water levels, talking to each hen individually as she worked. Thomas had built small roosting bars under Caleb's instruction, and together they'd reinforce the fence to keep out predators that saw chickens as easy meals. Caleb watched it all with an expression Mara was learning to read, a mixture of discomfort at the domesticity invading his carefully controlled space and something else, something softer that he quickly buried whenever he noticed it surfacing. He'd taken to checking the coop each evening, ostensibly to ensure Lucy had done her job properly, but Mara had caught him more than once standing there with his hand resting on the fence, just watching the birds settle for the night. The work fell into patterns. Caleb and Thomas spent mornings on ranch maintenance, their conversations growing easier as the boy proved his competence. Lucy divided her time between chicken care and helping Mara with household tasks, her cheerful chatter filling spaces that had known only silence for too long. And Mara herself moved through the house with increasing efficiency, learning its rhythms and quirks, making it function the way a home should. But beneath the developing routine, tension simmered. They were approaching the halfway point of the 30-day trial, and nobody spoke directly about what would happen when that deadline arrived. The question hung in the air like the perpetual summer heat, oppressive, unavoidable, impossible to ignore completely. It was Thomas who finally forced the issue, though not in any way Mara could have predicted. They were working together in the barn, Caleb teaching the boy how to properly maintain leather tack, when Thomas's hands suddenly stilled on the bridle he'd been oiling. His face had gone pale, his eyes fixed on the open barn door, where dust devils danced in the morning sun. "Mr. Mercer," Thomas said quietly, urgently, "there are men coming, 4 of them, riding hard." Caleb's head snapped up, his entire body going taut with immediate alertness. He moved to the door with fluid speed, his hand automatically going to his hip, where Mara knew he sometimes wore a gun belt when riding the far reaches of his property. He wasn't wearing it now, and his jaw tightened as he assessed the approaching riders. "Inside the house," Caleb ordered, his voice flat and hard in a way Thomas had never heard before. "Tell your mother to stay inside with Lucy, and you stay there too. Don't come out no matter what you hear." "But now, Thomas." The boy ran, and Caleb strode toward the house with long, purposeful steps that ate up the distance. Mara met him at the door, Lucy clutching her skirt, both of them registering the change in him, the way every muscle had tensed, the way his eyes had gone cold and calculating. "Trouble?" Mara asked, keeping her voice steady despite the fear climbing her throat. "Maybe. 4 riders coming in fast. Could be nothing, could be something." Caleb's eyes swept the yard, calculating distances and angles. "Stay inside. If shooting starts, get the children to the root cellar and don't come out until I tell you it's safe." "Caleb, this isn't a discussion, Mara." His use of her first name was startling in its intimacy and its urgency. "Whatever happens out here, your job is keeping those children safe, understand?" She nodded, pulling Lucy and Thomas back from the window, even as her own instincts screamed to know what was happening, who was coming, what danger had arrived to shatter their fragile peace. The riders materialized out of the heat shimmer, 4 hard-looking men on horses that showed signs of being pushed too hard for too long. They pulled up in the yard, raising a cloud of dust that hung in the still air like smoke. Caleb stood on the porch, arms loose at his sides, but his posture radiating a controlled violence that Mara had never seen in him before. The lead rider was a big man with a scar running from his temple to his jaw, his clothes dusty from travel but quality underneath the grime. He surveyed the ranch with eyes that missed nothing, then settled his gaze on Caleb with something that might have been respect or might have been threat. "Caleb Mercer," the man said, his voice carrying easily across the yard. "Been a long time." "Not long enough, Jack." Caleb's tone was absolutely neutral. "What brings you to my property?" "Heard you were doing well for yourself out here. Successful ranch, good cattle, living the respectable life." Jack dismounted slowly, keeping his hands visible. "Seems you've even got yourself a family now. Didn't figure you for the domestic type after. Inside the house, Mara's hands clenched into fists. She could hear the implied threat in every word, could see the way the other 3 riders had spread out slightly, positioning themselves to cover different angles of approach. These weren't casual visitors. These were men who understood violence intimately and used it as a tool. "State your business or move along," Caleb said. "I don't have time for reminiscing." "Business." Jack smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "See, there's a problem. You remember Charlie Dawson? Little fellow, quick temper, used to ride with us back in the day." "I remember Charlie's dead. Got himself shot in a dispute over cards 3 years ago in Cheyenne." "That's the one. Well, turns out Charlie had a brother. Name of Frank. And Frank's got some peculiar ideas about loyalty and revenge." Jack pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket. "Frank's offering $500 for information on certain individuals who might have been present when Charlie died. Your name's on his list." From her position at the window, Mara watched Caleb absorb this information with no visible reaction. But she'd learned to read him better over these past days, and she saw the minute tightening around his eyes, the barely perceptible shift in his stance. "I wasn't in Cheyenne 3 years ago," Caleb said flatly. "I've been right here, running this ranch, and I've got neighbors who can verify that." "Oh, I believe you." Jack's smile widened. "But Frank, he's not what you'd call reasonable. He's tracking down everyone who ever knew Charlie, everyone who might have had a grudge. And your name came up because you and Charlie had words once upon a time, back when you rode different trails than these respectable ones you're walking now." The revelation hit Mara like cold water. Caleb had ridden with outlaws. Not recently, perhaps, but in his past, the past he'd refused to discuss, the history he'd buried along with his wife and his former self. She looked at Thomas and saw the boy processing the same information, his face a mixture of confusion and concern. "I paid my debts to that life years ago," Caleb said, and there was steel in his voice now. "I don't ride those trails anymore, and I don't owe Frank Dawson anything except the truth that I had nothing to do with his brother's death." "See, that's where things get complicated," Jack gestured to his companions. "Frank's not interested in truth. He's interested in blood, and he's willing to pay us to deliver it. Now, we could ride in here shooting, burn you out, claim that bounty, but I remember when you saved my skin in Abilene back when we were both young and stupid, so I'm giving you a choice." "What choice?" "Ride out with us. Come talk to Frank face to face, convince him you're innocent. You've always been good with words when you needed to be. Maybe you can talk him down, make him see reason. And if I can't?" Jack's shrug was eloquent. "Then at least you tried. And maybe Frank respects that enough to leave this pretty little setup alone." His eyes flickered toward the house, and Mara felt her blood run cold. Be a shame if anything happened to your new family while you're being stubborn about old business. Inside the house, Thomas grabbed his mother's arm. "Ma, he can't go with them. They'll kill him." "Hush," Mara whispered, though her mind was racing through possibilities, all of them bad. Caleb stood silent for a long moment, calculating odds and angles. Finally, he spoke. "I need an hour to make arrangements for the ranch, settle things." "Half an hour," Jack countered. "And don't try anything clever. My boys here are fast, and they're not sentimental about collateral damage." "Half an hour," Caleb agreed and turned toward the house. The moment he stepped inside, Mara saw the controlled facade crack slightly. He moved to the gun cabinet, pulling out a rifle and a revolver, checking both with practiced efficiency. His hands were steady, but his jaw was so tight she could see the muscle jumping. "You can't go with them," Mara said quietly, aware that the children were listening to every word. "They'll kill you the moment you're away from witnesses." "They'll kill all of us if I don't." Caleb loaded the rifle with quick, economical movements. Jack Reeves isn't bluffing. He's a practical man who'll do whatever serves his interests. If that means burning this place to the ground to collect a bounty, he'll do it without losing sleep. "Then we fight." Mara moved to the window, assessing the positions of the 4 men outside. 4 against 4, you, me, and 2 children who shouldn't be anywhere near a gunfight. Caleb's voice was sharp. "No, this is my past catching up, my responsibility to handle. You keep Thomas and Lucy safe. That's all I'm asking." "You're asking us to let you ride to your death." Mara turned to face him fully, and something in her expression made him pause. "You think I don't see what this is? You think I don't understand that you've been waiting for something like this, some excuse to pay penance for being alive when Sarah's dead?" The words landed like physical blows. Caleb's face went white, then flushed with anger. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I? You've been half dead for 5 years, Caleb, going through motions, surviving instead of living, hiding behind walls so high you convinced yourself you were safe. But you're not safe. You're just alone. And now you're ready to throw away the first real chance you've had at connection because it's easier to be a martyr than it is to fight for something worth keeping." "Mara," Thomas started, but his mother held up her hand. "No, Thomas, this needs saying." She stepped closer to Caleb, close enough to see the war happening behind his eyes. "You made us a deal, 30 days. We've given you 12 of the best days this ranch has seen in years. Clean house, good food, actual conversation, children's laughter. You can't tell me that hasn't meant something." "It's meant everything," Caleb said hoarsely. "Which is exactly why I need to keep you safe. Even if that means Dying alone and leaving us to explain to Lucy why the man who finally agreed to get her chickens threw his life away? Mara's voice cracked. She's 5 years old, Caleb. She thinks you hung the moon because you let her count fence posts and approved her chicken names. You're going to break her heart because you're too scared to ask for help? Outside, Jack Reeves called out, 20 minutes, Mercer. Caleb looked at Mara, then at Thomas and Lucy, who were watching this exchange with wide, frightened eyes. Something in his face shifted, some fundamental decision being made in real time. The root cellar, he said finally. You take the children there now. It's reinforced, defensible, and it locks from inside. You stay there until this is over. And then what? You walk out there and surrender? I walk out there and negotiate. Caleb checked his revolver one more time. Jack owes me a debt. Maybe I can use that. Maybe I can convince him that Frank Dawson's bounty isn't worth making an enemy of someone who knows where bodies are buried, literally and figuratively. And if negotiation fails? Then I'm a better shot than anyone gives me credit for, and these walls are solid enough to provide cover. His eyes met hers, and Mara saw determination mixed with something that looked almost like hope. But I'm not surrendering. I'm not riding away to die quietly because it's easier than fighting. If that's what you're asking, whether I'm choosing life, then yes. I'm choosing to fight for what I've started to build here. Mara felt something unknot in her chest. Then you don't fight alone. Mara, I can shoot. My father taught me when I was 12, and I've kept practice when I could. Thomas, you take Lucy to the root cellar. Lock the door and don't open it unless you hear my voice or Mr. Caleb's, and only after we give you the signal word. What should the signal be? Thomas's face was pale, but resolute. Chickens. If you say the chickens are safe, we'll know it's really you. Smart boy. Mara turned to Caleb. Give me a weapon and tell me where to position myself. For a moment, Caleb looked like he was going to argue. Then he seemed to see something in her face. Maybe the same fierce determination that had made her call out his name in the middle of Main Street, or maybe just the recognition that she was every bit as stubborn as he was. Rifle, he said, handing her the weapon he'd just loaded. You know how to use this? Point and shoot. Don't jerk the trigger, account for distance, aim for center mass. Mara took the rifle, testing its weight. Where do you want me? Upstairs bedroom window. It's got clear sight lines to the yard and decent cover. You don't shoot unless they shoot first, or unless I give the signal. Understood? Understood. Lucy started to cry quietly, and Thomas wrapped his arm around his sister's shoulders. It's going to be okay, Lucy. Ma and Mr. Caleb know what they're doing. I'm scared, Lucy whispered. Caleb crouched down, bringing himself to the little girl's eye level. It was the first time Mara had seen him voluntarily make himself vulnerable in front of the children, lowering his defenses enough to meet Lucy on her terms. I'm scared too, he admitted quietly, but sometimes being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means being scared and doing the hard thing anyway. Your mama and I are going to do the hard thing, and we need you and Thomas to be brave in the root cellar. Can you do that? Lucy nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Will the chickens be okay? Despite everything, Caleb almost smiled. The chickens will be fine, and when this is over, you can check on them yourself and tell them all about how brave you were. 10 minutes. Jack's voice carried a warning edge now. Mara helped Thomas and Lucy into the root cellar, checking the lock mechanism and making sure they had water and a lantern. Thomas looked up at her with eyes too old for his 7 years. Ma, you come back. Promise me you'll come back. I promise I'll do everything in my power, Mara said, because she couldn't make promises about things she couldn't control. You take care of your sister. I love you both. Love you too, Ma. The cellar door closed with a solid thunk, and Mara heard the bolt slide home from inside. She took a deep breath, steadying herself, then moved to the upstairs bedroom with the rifle. The window gave her a clear view of the yard where Jack and his men waited, their patience clearly wearing thin. Caleb positioned himself at the front door, partially shielded by the heavy wood frame, but visible enough to talk. He'd strapped on his gun belt and held his own rifle loosely, ready, but not actively threatening. Time's up, Mercer, Jack called. You coming out, or do we come in? I'm staying right here, Caleb replied, his voice carrying across the yard with surprising calm. And you're going to listen to what I have to say before anyone does anything regrettable. Not much interested in talking anymore. Then let me make you interested. You remember Abilene, Jack? You remember why you owe me? Jack's posture shifted slightly. I remember. You remember that marshal, the one who had you dead to rights for that stagecoach robbery? You remember who convinced him he had the wrong man, who gave him another name to chase while you rode out free and clear? I remember. Jack's voice was quieter now, more cautious. That marshal was Sarah's uncle, my wife's uncle. I burned that bridge, destroyed that family connection to save your sorry hide because we'd ridden together and I believed in loyalty. Caleb's words were measured, deliberate. Now Sarah's gone, that bridge is ashes, and you're standing in my yard threatening the only family I've got left. So before you decide that Frank Dawson's bounty is worth more than the debt you owe, you think real hard about what kind of man you want to be. The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Mara watched from above, her finger resting alongside the trigger guard, her breathing shallow and controlled. She could see the other three riders looking at Jack, waiting for his decision, hands hovering near weapons. Frank Dawson's offering $500, Jack said finally. I'm offering something better. I'm offering you the chance to walk away clean, no blood on your hands, and the knowledge that we're square. The debt's paid. You never have to think about Abilene again. Caleb paused. Or you can try to collect that bounty, and I guarantee at least 2 of you will die in the process. My woman upstairs has a rifle trained on you right now, Jack. She's a better shot than you'd expect, and she's got nothing to lose. You want to bet your life on who's faster? Jack looked up at the window where Mara was positioned, and she let him see the rifle barrel, let him understand that Caleb wasn't bluffing. The calculation played across Jack's scarred face, potential reward versus certain risk, bounty money versus old debts and basic survival. You're asking me to walk away from $500, Jack said, but his tone had shifted from threatening to negotiating. I'm giving you the opportunity to keep your life and your honor. That ought to be worth more than money to a man who claims to value loyalty. Another long silence. One of the other riders shifted in his saddle, clearly uncomfortable with how this was playing out. The sun beat down mercilessly, and sweat trickled down Mara's spine as she maintained her aim, her muscles beginning to protest the sustained tension. Finally, Jack laughed, a short, harsh sound without humor. You always did have a silver tongue when you needed it, Mercer. Fine. We're square. But you'd best hope I never see you outside this property, because next time I might not be feeling so generous about old times. Understood. And Jack? Caleb's voice hardened. You tell Frank Dawson that if he's got a problem with me, he can ride out here himself and we'll settle it face to face. But if he sends hired guns after my family, I will hunt him to the ends of the earth and make him regret every second of his existence. You make sure he understands that. Jack nodded once, a sharp gesture of acknowledgement. He mounted his horse, and the other 3 riders followed suit. You've changed, Caleb. Used to be you'd run from a fight rather than stand your ground. I've got more to lose now, Caleb replied simply, and more worth fighting for. The riders left at a trot, raising dust that hung in the air long after they disappeared over the rise. Mara stayed at the window, maintaining her position until Caleb called up to her. They're gone, out of rifle range. You can come down. Her legs were shaking as she descended the stairs, adrenaline draining away and leaving her weak and trembling. Caleb met her at the bottom, taking the rifle from her unsteady hands and setting it aside. For a moment they just stood there, close enough to touch but not touching, both processing what had just happened. You called me your woman, Mara said, and was startled to hear her voice shake. You told Jack I was yours. I did. Caleb's eyes were intense, searching her face. I didn't ask permission. Should have, probably. But in that moment, it felt like the truth. It felt like the truth to me too, Mara admitted, which is terrifying and confusing and completely outside the bounds of our practical arrangement. Practical arrangements can change, Caleb said quietly, if both parties are willing. Before Mara could respond, they heard the root cellar door scraping open. Thomas emerged first, Lucy close behind him, both children pale but composed. Lucy ran straight to Caleb, wrapping her small arms around his waist with the same unconscious affection she'd shown before. The chickens are safe, Lucy announced solemnly, clearly having waited to hear the signal. We were very brave in the root cellar, But I'm glad we can come out now. Caleb's hand came up automatically this time, resting on Lucy's head with increasing comfort. You were very brave, both of you. I'm proud of how you handled yourselves. Thomas looked between his mother and Caleb with an expression far too knowing for a 7-year-old. Are we staying? Past the 30 days, I mean? The question hung in the air, unsubtle and impossible to avoid. Mara met Caleb's eyes over Lucy's head, and something unspoken passed between them. A recognition of how much had changed in 12 short days, how a practical arrangement had evolved into something far more complicated and infinitely more precious. That depends, Caleb said carefully, on whether your mother thinks this ranch is a good place to build a permanent life. I think, Mara said slowly, choosing each word with care, that this ranch has good bones and good land, and a good man trying very hard to remember how to be alive instead of just surviving. I think my children are thriving here. I think the chickens are happy. And I think, she paused, gathering courage. I think I want to see what develops if we give this more than 30 days. So do I, Caleb admitted, and the relief in his voice was palpable. So do I. Lucy squeezed tighter, clearly delighted with this turn of events. Does this mean we're really staying forever and ever? It means we're staying as long as it keeps working for everyone, Mara corrected gently. But yes, sweetheart, we're staying. Thomas smiled, a genuine expression of happiness that transformed his serious little face. Good. I like it here. And Mr. Caleb still has a lot to teach me about ranching. That evening, after the children were asleep and the house had settled into quiet, Caleb and Mara found themselves on the porch once again. But this time, when Caleb sat in his chair, he gestured to the space beside him, an invitation rather than resigned tolerance of her presence. I need to tell you about my past, Caleb said without preamble. If we're doing this, really doing this, you deserve to know what you're getting into. Only if you're ready, Mara replied. I won't force confessions. I rode with outlaws for 3 years, Caleb said bluntly. Not the romantic kind from dime novels. The real kind, men who robbed and stole and occasionally killed when circumstances required it. I never killed anyone, but I stood by while others did, which maybe makes me worse than if I'd pulled the trigger myself. Mara listened without judgment, letting him speak at his own pace. I met Sarah in a town we were passing through. She saw something in me worth saving, convinced me to leave that life behind. We got married, came out here, started fresh. For 6 months, I believed I could be the man she saw when she looked at me. His voice roughened. Then she died, and I realized I'd brought her to this isolated place for my own selfish need to escape my past, and that selfishness killed her as surely as the fever did. Fever killed her, Mara said firmly. Not you, not this ranch, not any choice either of you made. Sometimes people die, Caleb, and there's no one to blame because life is just that cruel and random. I've spent 5 years believing otherwise. I know, but maybe it's time to stop. Mara reached over and took his hand, a simple gesture that felt monumental in its implications. Maybe it's time to accept that you can't control everything, that loss happens despite our best efforts, and that punishing yourself doesn't honor Sarah's memory. It just wastes the life she wanted you to have. Caleb's fingers tightened around hers. I'm not good at this, at letting people in, at trusting that things won't fall apart. Neither am I, Mara admitted. I've spent 2 years keeping my children at arm's length from any man who showed interest because I was terrified of choosing wrong and putting them in danger. But Thomas and Lucy need more than just survival. They need a home, stability, someone who will teach them and protect them and show them that the world can be good even when it's hard. And you? Caleb asked quietly. What do you need? Mara considered the question seriously, turning it over in her mind before answering. I need partnership, honest work, and honest conversation. I need to feel like I'm building something instead of just scrambling to keep from losing ground. And I need... She paused, feeling vulnerable in a way she hadn't expected. I need to be seen, really seen, not as a burden or a charity case or a convenient housekeeper, but as a person with value beyond my utility. I see you, Caleb said, and the intensity in his voice made Mara's breath catch. I see how hard you work, how fiercely you protect your children, how you face every challenge head-on without complaints or excuses. I see your strength and your kindness and your refusal to settle for less than what you and your children deserve." He lifted their joined hands, studying them in the starlight. "I see you, Mara Wells, and what I see makes me want to be better than I've been." They sat like that for a long time, hands clasped, the night air finally cooling enough to make breathing comfortable. Above them, stars wheeled across the enormous Wyoming sky, indifferent to human drama and human hope alike. But down here, on this porch, two people who'd been running from pain found themselves running towards something else entirely, something that looked suspiciously like a future worth fighting for. The morning after they'd decided to extend their arrangement beyond the original 30 days, Mara woke to find Caleb already gone from the house. Not unusual, he often rose before dawn to check on the cattle or handle early chores, but today felt different somehow, charged with the unspoken acknowledgement that everything had shifted between them. She moved through the familiar morning routine, starting coffee and preparing breakfast while Thomas and Lucy still slept. The kitchen had become truly hers over these past 2 weeks, organized according to her preferences, stocked with supplies she'd requested and Caleb had provided without question. Small things that added up to belonging. Through the window, she saw him emerge from the barn leading his horse, but instead of mounting and riding out as he usually did, he tied the animal to the porch rail and came inside. His hat was already dusty, his sleeves rolled to his elbows, but there was something in his expression that made Mara set down the coffee pot and give him her full attention. "I need to go into town today," Caleb said without preamble. "Got some business to handle at the land office and the bank. Thought maybe you and the children would want to come along." Mara felt her eyebrows raise slightly. In the 2 weeks they'd been here, Caleb had made one supply run alone, preferring to keep his town visits brief and solitary. The offer to bring them was significant, a public declaration that they were part of his life now, not just temporary help hidden away on his ranch. "The children would enjoy that," Mara said carefully. "Lucy's been asking about the general store, and Thomas could use new boots. His are wearing through." "I noticed." Caleb poured himself coffee, his movements economical as always. "Figured we'd make a day of it. Handle the necessary business, get what's needed, maybe stop at the restaurant for a meal, let people see—" He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "Let people see that things have changed." "You mean let them see that the unapproachable Caleb Mercer has acquired a ready-made family?" Mara said, keeping her tone light despite the seriousness of what they were discussing. "That's exactly what I mean." Caleb met her eyes over the rim of his coffee cup. "And I want to make sure you're comfortable with that. Town gossip can be vicious, especially about women in your position. They'll have opinions about our arrangement, and not all of them will be kind." Mara considered this, weighing pride against practicality. She'd faced worse than small-town gossip in her 2 years of widowhood, landlords who assumed she'd pay rent with more than money, employers who thought desperate women had no right to dignity, strangers who judged her for traveling alone with children. She'd survived all of it with her spine straight and her head high. "Let them talk," she said finally. "I know what I am and what I'm not. If they want to make assumptions, that's their business. My business is building a life for my children and contributing fairly to this household. Their opinions don't change those facts." Something that might have been admiration flickered across Caleb's face. "You're stronger than most people give you credit for." "I've had to be. Strength isn't optional when you have children depending on you." They left an hour later, the four of them crowded onto the wagon bench with Thomas and Lucy wedged between the adults. Lucy chattered excitedly about everything they passed: a hawk circling overhead, wildflowers blooming despite the drought, a jackrabbit that bounded away from the road. Thomas maintained a more dignified silence, but Mara could see the anticipation in the way he kept glancing toward town as it gradually appeared on the horizon. Sentinel Ridge looked exactly as it had 2 weeks ago, dusty, sun-bleached, stubbornly surviving in the harsh Wyoming territory. But Mara's perspective had changed. This wasn't just some random settlement where she'd made a desperate gamble. This was the closest thing to a hometown she and her children had now, the place where they'd buy supplies and eventually make connections. Caleb drove straight to the land office, a small building squeezed between the barber shop and a lawyer's office. He helped Mara and the children down from the wagon with a courtesy that drew interested glances from passers-by, then paused before entering. "This might take a while," he said. You could browse the general store, let the children pick something small. What business are you conducting? Mara asked, then immediately regretted the question. I'm sorry, that's not my concern. It is, actually. Caleb's jaw tightened, but not with anger, with the visible effort of pushing past his instinct for privacy. I'm filing paperwork to expand my property claim. There's an adjacent section that's been abandoned, and I'm making it official that I'm taking it over. More land means more cattle, which means more income, which means... He stopped, took a breath. Which means I can better support a family of 4 instead of just myself. The implication settled over Mara like a warm blanket. He wasn't just accepting their presence for 30 days or even a few months. He was planning for a future that included them, making concrete decisions based on that assumption. That's good land, Mara said softly. You'll make good use of it. We'll make good use of it, Caleb corrected, then seemed surprised by his own words. But he didn't take them back. I'll find you at the store when I'm done. The general store was busy for a weekday, filled with women examining fabric and men discussing feed prices. Conversations died briefly when Mara entered with the children, then resumed at a slightly lower volume, the universal sign that she'd become the topic of discussion. She ignored it with practiced ease, guiding Thomas and Lucy toward the children's section. You can each choose one thing, she told them quietly. Something small and practical. Lucy immediately gravitated toward a display of hair ribbons, her small fingers stroking the colorful satin with reverent care. Thomas wandered toward the tools, eyeing a small knife designed for boys his age, with obvious longing. Mrs. Wells, isn't it? Mara turned to find herself facing a well-dressed woman in her 40s, with sharp eyes and a smile that didn't quite reach them. She recognized the type immediately, the social arbiter of a small town, the woman who decided who was acceptable and who wasn't. It is, Mara confirmed, keeping her voice pleasant and neutral. Margaret Henderson. My husband owns the feed store. The woman's gaze swept over Mara's worn but clean dress, then moved to the children. I heard you'd taken a position at the Mercer Ranch. Quite isolated out there, isn't it? Must be lonely for the children. The implied criticism was clear, but Mara refused to take the bait. The children are thriving. Fresh air, wide open spaces, good honest work. It's a healthy environment. I'm sure. Mrs. Henderson's tone suggested she was sure of nothing of the kind. Of course, there's been quite a bit of talk about the arrangement. A widow with young children, living alone with an unmarried man. Some people might consider it improper. Some people might consider it survival, Mara replied calmly. My children need a home. Mr. Mercer needs household help. It's a practical arrangement that benefits everyone involved. Oh, I'm sure it's very practical. The emphasis on this last word carried implications that made Mara's hands clench. I just hope you understand how things might appear to others. Reputation is important, especially for a woman in your position. Before Mara could respond, another voice cut through the tension. Margaret, always so concerned with appearances, must be exhausting, keeping track of everyone else's business when you've got your own household to run. The speaker was a younger woman, maybe 30, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense air. She positioned herself beside Mara in a gesture of clear solidarity. Sarah Jenkins, she introduced herself, extending her hand to Mara. I run the boarding house on 3rd Street, and I happen to think it's nobody's business how a woman chooses to provide for her children, as long as those children are safe and cared for. Mrs. Henderson's face tightened. I was merely expressing community concern. You were gossiping, Sarah interrupted flatly. And poorly at that. Caleb Mercer is one of the most honorable men in this territory. If he's offered Mrs. Wells employment and housing, you can be damn sure it's above board. She turned to Mara with a genuine smile. Don't let the busybodies get to you. Half of them are just jealous that they didn't think of the arrangement first. Mercer's a catch, even if he is stubborn as a mule. Mara felt warmth bloom in her chest, the unexpected gift of an ally in unfamiliar territory. Thank you, Miss Jenkins. Mrs. Jenkins, actually, widow like yourself. Sarah's expression softened. Lost my husband to mine collapse 4 years back. Opened the boarding house to keep food on the table. I know what it's like to do what you have to do and deal with the judgment that comes with it. Mrs. Henderson made a disapproving sound and retreated to examine fabric on the other side of the store. Sarah watched her go with satisfaction, then focused on the children. "And who are these fine young people?" "My son Thomas and my daughter Lucy," Mara introduced them, pride evident in her voice. "Ma'am," Thomas said politely, while Lucy offered a small curtsy she'd learned from a storybook. "Very polite," Sarah approved. "Your mother's raising you right." She glanced at the items the children were holding. "You thinking about those ribbons, sweetie?" Lucy nodded shyly. "They're very pretty, but Mama says we can only choose one thing each. Smart Mama. Pretty things are nice, but practical's better." Sarah crouched down to Lucy's level. "Although I'll tell you a secret, sometimes pretty things can be practical too. Good ribbons keep hair out of your face when you're working, and if they're pretty while doing it, that's just extra." Lucy's face lit up, and she looked to her mother for confirmation. Mara nodded, and Lucy clutched the ribbons tighter. Thomas, meanwhile, had made his selection. Not the knife he'd been eyeing, but a small book about animal husbandry. When Mara raised a questioning eyebrow, he explained seriously, "Mr. Caleb's teaching me about cattle. This book might help me learn faster." "Wise choice," Sarah said approvingly. "Knowledge is the best investment a young man can make." They completed their purchases just as Caleb entered the store, his business at the land office evidently concluded. He took in the scene quickly, Mara with the children, Sarah standing beside them in clear support, and the other women in the store watching with varying degrees of interest and disapproval. "Mrs. Jenkins," he greeted Sarah with a nod. "Didn't expect to see you here today." "Just picking up supplies," Sarah replied easily, "and making the acquaintance of Mrs. Wells and her delightful children. You've got good people at your ranch now, Caleb." "I do," Caleb agreed, and the simple acknowledgement made several women exchange significant glances. "You ready?" he asked Mara. "Ready," she confirmed, gathering her purchases. Outside, Caleb loaded the packages into the wagon, then surprised everyone by suggesting they go to the restaurant for lunch. It was a small establishment, nothing fancy, but it represented another public declaration of their changed circumstances. They ate roast beef and potatoes while Lucy told Caleb all about the ribbons she'd chosen, and Thomas explained his reasoning for selecting the book. Caleb listened to both children with genuine attention, occasionally asking questions that showed he was truly interested. Watching him, Mara saw the man he must have been before grief had frozen him, engaged, thoughtful, capable of warmth. That man was still there, just buried under years of protective ice that was finally beginning to thaw. They were finishing their meal when the door opened and a man entered who made Caleb go very still. He was tall and lean, with a marshal's badge pinned to his vest and eyes that missed nothing. He surveyed the restaurant, his gaze pausing briefly on their table before he approached. "Caleb Mercer," the marshal said, his voice neutral but carrying authority. "Didn't expect to find you taking lunch in town like a civilized citizen." "Marshal Garrett," Caleb replied, equally neutral. "Thought you were stationed in Cheyenne." "Was. Got transferred here last month. Seems Sentinel Ridge needed a more permanent law presence." Garrett's eyes moved to Mara and the children. "Heard you'd taken on help at your ranch." "Not help," Caleb corrected, his voice carrying an edge now. "Family." The word hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning. Garrett's eyebrows rose slightly, but he nodded as if accepting the clarification. "Good for you. Man shouldn't live alone too long. Makes him either mean or dead inside. Sometimes both." He tipped his hat to Mara. "Ma'am? Children, enjoy your meal." After the marshal left, Mara noticed that Caleb's jaw was tight and his hands had clenched into fists on the table. "You know him?" "We've crossed paths," Caleb said tersely. "Years ago, before Sarah. He was a deputy then, green and eager to prove himself. I was—" He stopped, glanced at the children, then chose his words carefully. "I was running with people he was trying to catch." "Did he catch them?" "Eventually, most of them." Caleb's voice was flat. "I got out before things went completely sideways, but Garrett knows my history. Having him as the local marshal is going to be complicated." "Complicated how?" "Complicated in that he'll be watching me, waiting for me to slip back into old patterns." Caleb met her eyes. "And he'll be watching you and the children too, making sure I'm not causing harm to people who don't deserve it." Mara considered this, then shrugged slightly. "Then we'll just have to show him there's nothing to watch. We're building an honest life, Caleb. Let him observe that." Some of the tension left Caleb's shoulders. You make it sound simple. Not simple. Just straightforward. We do the work, we raise the children, we build something good. If the marshal wants to watch that, he's welcome to bore himself with our domestic routine. Lucy, who'd been quietly coloring on the back of her napkin with a pencil the waitress had provided, looked up suddenly. Is the marshal a bad man? No, sweetheart, Caleb said, his voice gentling. He's actually a good man doing a hard job. He just knows things about my past that make him cautious. What kind of things? Things that happened before you were born, before your mother and I even met. Mistakes I made when I was younger and stupider. Caleb's honesty was startling in its directness. But I learned from those mistakes, and I'm trying very hard not to repeat them. Thomas had been listening intently, his young face serious. Pa used to say that mistakes only count against you if you don't learn from them. If you learn and change, then they're just lessons. Your father was a wise man, Caleb said quietly. He was, Thomas agreed, but he's gone now, so we need someone else to teach us things. The implicit question hung there, and Mara held her breath, waiting to see how Caleb would respond. He looked at Thomas for a long moment, then at Lucy, then at Mara. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion he wasn't quite managing to hide. I'm not trying to replace your father. Nobody could do that. But if you're willing, I'd be honored to teach you what I know, about ranching, about this land, about how to be honorable even when it's hard. I'm willing, Thomas said immediately. Very willing. Me too, Lucy added, though Mara suspected she wasn't entirely sure what she was agreeing to. Will you teach me about chickens too? Despite the emotional weight of the moment, Caleb's mouth quirked. I suspect you already know more about chickens than I do, but yes, we'll learn together. They finished their meal and made one more stop, at the bank, where Caleb conducted business that left him looking satisfied when he emerged. He said nothing about it, but Mara noticed he seemed more settled, as if he'd taken concrete steps toward a future he was finally allowing himself to imagine. The ride home was quieter than the morning journey, all four of them tired from the day's activities and the emotional undercurrents that had run through it. Lucy fell asleep against Mara's shoulder, and Thomas dozed against Caleb's side. The adults said nothing, but Mara was acutely aware of Caleb's presence beside her, the warmth of his arm occasionally brushing hers as the wagon jostled over the rough road. As they approached the ranch, the sun was beginning its descent, painting everything in shades of amber and gold. The house looked welcoming in that light, smoke rising from the chimney where Mara had banked the fire that morning. The chickens were visible in their coop, settling down for the evening. It looked like a home, not just a structure, but a place where life happened. I talked to the land office about more than just the property claim, Caleb said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. I asked about what it would take to formalize our arrangement, to make you and the children legally part of this household. Mara's breath caught. What did they say? They said the simplest way would be marriage. Makes everything clear-cut, property rights, inheritance, legal guardianship of the children. He kept his eyes on the road ahead, his voice carefully neutral. But I know that's not what we agreed to. I know you said you weren't looking for romance or rescue, just honest work and stability. I did say that, Mara agreed carefully. So I want to make sure you understand. I'm not proposing out of passion or romance. I'm proposing out of practicality and mutual benefit. Now Caleb did look at her, his winter ice eyes serious and searching. But I'm also proposing because over these past 2 weeks, I've come to value your presence in my life. Your competence, your strength, your refusal to coddle me or accept less than what you and your children deserve. I think we could build something good together, Mara. Something honest and lasting. That's not exactly a romantic proposal, Mara observed, though her heart was beating faster than the words suggested. No, it's not. But it's truthful. Caleb's hands tightened on the reins. I'm not going to promise you love, because I'm not sure I'm capable of that anymore. Sarah took that part of me when she died. But I can promise you respect, partnership, and absolute commitment to you and your children's well-being. Is that enough? Mara thought about the question seriously, turning it over in her mind from every angle. She thought about romantic love, about the passion she'd shared with her first husband that had burned bright and quick before settling into comfortable companionship. She thought about her children's needs, about stability and security, and the simple gift of a home that couldn't be taken away by a landlord's whim or an employer's judgment. And she thought about Caleb himself, this complicated, damaged man who was fighting so hard to let life back in, who'd stood up to armed men to protect them, who listened to Lucy talk about chickens with genuine attention and taught Thomas with patient care. "I think," she said slowly, "that respect and partnership and commitment might actually be more valuable than romantic love. Romance fades, but mutual respect can last a lifetime if you tend it properly." "Is that a yes?" "It's a yes," Mara confirmed, "but I have conditions." "Name them." "First, we tell the children together and make sure they understand this is about building a family, not replacing anyone. Second, we agree that if this arrangement stops working for either of us, we'll communicate honestly rather than let resentment build. And third," she paused, gathering courage for the most important condition. "Third, you agree to keep trying, to keep thawing out, to keep letting us in, to keep fighting against the grief that wants to freeze you solid. I can handle a lot, Caleb, but I can't build a life with someone who's only half present." Caleb absorbed this, nodding slowly. "Those are fair terms. I agree to all of them, and I have one condition of my own." "What's that?" "That you never pretend things are fine when they're not. I need honesty, Mara. Brutal honesty, if necessary. I've spent 5 years lying to myself about being okay. I need you to call me on it when I slip back into that pattern." "I can do that," Mara promised. "I'm not afraid of difficult conversations." "I've noticed." There was warmth in Caleb's voice now, almost affection. "When do you want to do this? The marriage, I mean." "Soon," Mara said practically. "No point in dragging it out and giving the town gossips more ammunition. Next week?" "Next week," Caleb agreed. They pulled into the ranch yard just as the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in impossible colors. Thomas woke first, blinking sleep from his eyes and looking around with the disorientation of someone who'd dozed off mid-journey. Lucy remained asleep, her small body warm and trusting against her mother's side. Caleb lifted Lucy gently from the wagon, cradling her with surprising care as he carried her toward the house. Thomas jumped down and grabbed packages while Mara gathered the remaining supplies. They moved together with the practiced coordination of people who'd learned each other's rhythms, unloading the wagon and settling back into their evening routine. After the children were fed and put to bed, after the kitchen was cleaned and tomorrow's bread was set to rise, Mara joined Caleb on the porch for what had become their nightly ritual. But tonight felt different, weighted with the decisions they'd made and the future they'd committed to building. "Are you scared?" Caleb asked into the darkness. "Terrified," Mara admitted. "But I've learned that being scared and moving forward anyway is usually better than staying safe and staying stuck." "Same," Caleb said quietly. "I'm scared I'll disappoint you, that I'll fail your children, that I'm too damaged to be what you need. And I'm scared I'm asking too much, expecting you to heal on a timeline that suits my needs rather than yours." Mara shifted in her chair, turning to face him even though the darkness made it hard to see his expression. "But we're doing this anyway. Because the alternative, going our separate ways, you back to isolation and me back to uncertainty, is worse than the risk of trying." "When did you get so wise?" "When I became responsible for 2 lives that depend on me making good decisions." Mara's voice softened. "They like you, you know. Thomas respects you, and Lucy adores you. That's not something I take lightly." "I like them too," Caleb said, and the admission seemed to surprise him. "Thomas reminds me of myself at that age, serious, eager to prove himself, carrying responsibilities too heavy for young shoulders. And Lucy—" He stopped, struggling for words. "Lucy makes me remember what hope looks like. She's so damn optimistic about everything, even chickens." "Especially chickens," Mara corrected with a small smile. "Especially chickens," Caleb agreed, and there was warmth in his voice, maybe even the beginning of laughter. They sat together until the stars came out in full force, until the temperature dropped and the night sounds took over from the day. And when they finally went inside to their separate rooms, Mara felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not just hope for the future, but actual anticipation for what tomorrow might bring. In the room she shared with her children, she checked on Thomas and Lucy, tucking the quilt more securely around their sleeping forms. Thomas had his book about animal husbandry on the nightstand, already dog-eared from evening reading. Lucy clutched her new ribbons even in sleep, her small face peaceful and content. "We're going to be okay," Mara whispered to them, though they couldn't hear. "We're going to build something real here, I promise." And for the first time in 2 years, Mara believed her own promises about the future. The conversation with the children happened the next morning over breakfast, and it went differently than either Mara or Caleb had anticipated. They'd planned careful words, gentle explanations about practicality and family and building a future together. But before they could deliver their rehearsed speech, Lucy looked up from her eggs and announced with absolute certainty, "You're going to marry Mama, aren't you, Mr. Caleb?" Caleb nearly choked on his coffee. Mara set down her fork with deliberate care, trying to hide her surprise. "What makes you say that, sweetheart?" "Because you look at each other the way Pa used to look at Mama," Lucy explained matter-of-factly. "And because Thomas said yesterday that Mr. Caleb called us family, and family means we all belong together, and belonging together means getting married so nobody can say we don't really count." Thomas, who'd been carefully buttering his bread, nodded without looking up. "I figured it was coming. Makes sense. We need a home. Mr. Caleb needs help, and Mama needs—" He paused, choosing words with the precision of someone much older. "Mama needs someone who sees her as more than just someone who works hard." "And does Mr. Caleb see her that way?" Mara asked gently, curious about her son's perceptions. "He does," Thomas confirmed, finally meeting her eyes. "He looks at you like you matter, not like those other men in Philadelphia who looked at you like you were—" He stopped, clearly aware he was treading into territory that might upset his mother. "Like I was desperate and therefore available," Mara finished for him, her voice steady despite the old anger that memory stirred. "I know what they saw, Thomas. And you're right. Caleb doesn't look at me that way." "So, are you getting married?" Lucy pressed, bouncing slightly in her chair with anticipation. Caleb cleared his throat, his discomfort with the scrutiny visible, but his commitment to honesty stronger. "We are. Next week, if that's acceptable to both of you. But we wanted you to understand what this means and what it doesn't mean." "It means Mr. Caleb becomes our stepfather," Thomas said carefully. "It means this ranch becomes our real home, and we don't have to worry about leaving. It means—" His voice cracked slightly. "It means we get to stay." "It does mean all those things," Caleb confirmed. "But it doesn't mean I'm trying to replace your father. That's not possible, and it's not what I want. Your pa was a good man who loved you both, and his place in your heart stays his. I'm just—" He struggled for the right words. "I'm just hoping there's room for me too, in a different way." Lucy slid off her chair and walked around the table to Caleb, wrapping her small arms around his waist in a gesture that had become familiar over the past weeks. "There's lots of room," she assured him solemnly. "Hearts are very big. Mama says so." "Mama's right," Caleb said, his voice rougher than usual as he returned the embrace with increasing comfort. "Hearts can hold more than we think they can." Thomas remained at the table, his young face serious as he processed this information. Finally, he spoke. "Can I call you Pa? Or would you rather I keep calling you Mr. Caleb?" The question clearly hit Caleb hard. Mara saw him blink rapidly, saw his throat work as he swallowed against sudden emotion. When he answered, his voice was barely above a whisper. "You can call me whatever feels right to you, Thomas. I'd be honored by Pa, but I'd understand if that name belongs only to your father's memory." Thomas considered this with the gravity of a judge rendering verdict. "I think maybe both. You'll be Pa Caleb. That way it's clear you're both, the one I remember and the one who's here now." "Pa Caleb works," Caleb agreed, and Mara saw him wipe surreptitiously at his eyes. "That works just fine." The wedding was planned for the following Saturday, a simple ceremony at the small church on the edge of Sentinel Ridge. Mara had no family to invite, and Caleb's only remaining relative was a brother in California he hadn't spoken to in a decade. But Sarah Jenkins offered to stand as witness, and the ranch hand from the neighboring property, a grizzled old cowboy named Pete, who'd known Caleb for years, agreed to do the same. The days between the decision and the ceremony passed in a blur of preparation. Mara spent her evenings altering a dress she'd found in the bottom of her trunk, letting out seams that had grown too tight during her months of irregular meals, and taking in others to account for the weight she'd gained from regular, nourishing food. It was a simple dress, dark blue calico that had seen better days, but she cleaned and pressed it until it looked almost new. Lucy appointed herself wedding planner, decorating the house with wildflowers she and Thomas picked from the meadow beyond the north pasture. She talked constantly about the ceremony, asking questions about what would happen and whether the chickens could attend. When told that chickens were not typically wedding guests, she accepted this with visible disappointment but rallied by suggesting they at least needed to be informed of the important event. Thomas threw himself into ranch work with renewed intensity, as if he was trying to prove his worth before the wedding made their positions official. Caleb noticed and gently told the boy that he didn't need to earn his place, that it was already secure. But Thomas kept working anyway, channeling his nervous energy into useful labor, and Caleb himself seemed to be waging an internal war between hope and fear. Mara would catch him sometimes, standing at the window staring at the mountains, or sitting on the porch long after everyone else had gone to bed. She didn't push him to talk about whatever he was processing, understanding that some battles had to be fought in solitude, but she made sure he knew she was there, present and steady, whenever he was ready to reach out. 3 days before the wedding, Marshal Garrett appeared at the ranch. Mara saw him riding up the drive and felt her stomach clench with anxiety. She called for Caleb, who emerged from the barn with Thomas close behind. "Marshal," Caleb greeted him, his voice neutral but his body tense. "This a social call or official business?" Garrett dismounted slowly, his eyes taking in the scene, the well-maintained ranch, the children visible in the doorway, Mara standing on the porch with her chin raised despite her obvious nerves. "Bit of both, actually. Mind if we talk?" "Go ahead and talk. Nothing here I need to hide from my family." The emphasis on the last word made Garrett's eyebrows rise, but he nodded acceptance. "Fair enough. I'll be direct then. I've been asking around about you, Mercer. About your past, your time running with Jack Reeves and that crew. What happened when you left that life? And what did you learn?" Caleb's voice was flat, giving nothing away. "That you got out clean 5 years ago when you married. That you've run a legitimate operation here ever since, never caused trouble, paid your debts, been as honest as a man can be in this territory." Garrett paused. "Also learned that Jack Reeves and his boys rode out here a couple weeks back, and whatever conversation happened sent them packing without violence. That true?" "It is. And you accomplished that through negotiation rather than gunfire." "I did. Reminded Jack he owed me a debt, and that collecting Frank Dawson's bounty wasn't worth making an enemy of someone who knows his history." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Is that a problem?" "On the contrary." Garrett's expression softened slightly. "That's exactly the kind of smart thinking that keeps communities safe. You could have shot it out, gotten yourself and possibly your family killed, created a whole mess I'd have had to clean up. Instead, you handled it clean. That speaks well of you." Mara felt some of her tension ease, though she remained watchful. "I also heard," Garrett continued, "that you're getting married this Saturday. That you're making this family arrangement official and permanent." "That's right. You here to object?" "Hell no. I'm here to congratulate you." Garrett extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Caleb shook it. Man who can walk away from his past and build something honest deserves respect, not suspicion. "I wanted you to know that while I'll always be keeping an eye on things, that's my job, I'm not looking for reasons to doubt you. You've earned the benefit of that doubt." "I appreciate that," Caleb said, and the relief in his voice was audible. "More than you know. Just keep being the man you've been for the past 5 years, and we'll have no problems." Garrett tipped his hat to Mara. "Ma'am, I hope you'll both be very happy. This territory needs more good families putting down roots." After the marshal left, Caleb stood in the yard for a long moment, his shoulders gradually relaxing as he processed what had just happened. Mara approached him carefully, recognizing that he was dealing with something significant. "That was important to you," she observed. "Having his approval." "Having his trust," Caleb corrected. "Garrett's a good lawman, fair but thorough. If he'd decided I was still a threat, he could have made our lives very difficult. Instead, he's giving us, a chance to prove we're exactly what we appear to be." "And what do we appear to be?" "A family," Caleb said simply. Just a regular family trying to build a decent life. Saturday arrived with cloudless skies and temperatures that promised another scorching day. Mara woke early, her stomach fluttering with nerves despite the practical nature of the arrangement. She dressed carefully in her altered blue dress, pinning up her hair with the new combs Sarah Jenkins had given her as a wedding gift. Lucy sat on the bed, watching with wide eyes and offering a running commentary on how beautiful her mother looked. In the next room, she could hear Caleb moving around, the creak of floorboards and the splash of water in the basin as he cleaned up. Thomas had been dispatched to the barn to make sure the wagon was ready, giving the adults a few moments of privacy to prepare. When Mara emerged from her room, she found Caleb waiting in the main room, dressed in clothes she'd never seen before. A dark suit that must have been buried in his trunk for years, pressed and brushed until it looked almost new. His hair was combed back, his jaw freshly shaved, and he held his hat in his hands with the awkward uncertainty of a man who didn't quite know what to do with himself. They stared at each other for a long moment, and Mara saw in his eyes the same mixture of hope and terror she felt in her own chest. This was real. This was happening. They were about to bind their lives together in the most permanent way available, trusting that mutual respect and shared purpose would be enough to build something lasting. "You look beautiful," Caleb said finally, his voice rough. "You clean up well yourself," Mara replied, managing a small smile despite her nerves. "Ready?" "No, but let's do it anyway." The church was small and simple, with rough wooden pews and windows that let in streams of golden sunlight. Sarah Jenkins was already there, along with Pete and a handful of curious townspeople who'd heard about the wedding and come to witness the event. Mrs. Henderson sat in the back row, her expression suggesting she'd come more to judge than to celebrate, but Mara refused to let that bother her. The ceremony itself was brief and businesslike, exactly as they'd requested. The minister, an elderly man who'd seen enough frontier marriages to know better than to assume romance, kept his words simple and practical. He spoke of partnership, mutual support, and the responsibilities they were undertaking toward each other and the children. When it came time for vows, Caleb spoke his clearly and firmly, his eyes on Mara's face. "I promise to provide for you and your children, to treat you with respect and honesty, and to build a life with you that's worthy of the trust you're placing in me." Mara's own vows were equally straightforward. "I promise to manage our household with care, to support your work, and to be a true partner in building our future together." No promises of love, no romantic declarations. Just honest acknowledgement of what they were committing to and what they hoped to build. When the minister pronounced them married, Caleb leaned forward and kissed Mara's cheek, a brief chaste touch that nevertheless sent warmth flooding through her. It was their first kiss, she realized with something like shock. In all the weeks they'd spent together, they'd never once crossed that boundary. And now they were married. Lucy threw wildflower petals she'd been hoarding in her pockets, creating a small blizzard of color that made several people laugh. Thomas stood beside them, his young face solemn with the weight of the moment. But when Caleb put his hand on the boy's shoulder in a gesture of inclusion, Thomas smiled with genuine happiness. The small gathering moved outside where Sarah had arranged for refreshments. Nothing fancy, just lemonade and cookies, but the gesture of celebration was appreciated. People offered congratulations with varying degrees of sincerity, but Mara noticed that even the disapproving ones seemed to soften when they saw how the children clung to Caleb, how naturally he included them in his responses. "You've got yourself a ready-made family," Pete observed, accepting a glass of lemonade from Lucy with exaggerated courtesy. "That's no small thing." "No, it's not," Caleb agreed, his hand resting protectively on Thomas's shoulder. "It's everything." They stayed for an hour of socializing before making their excuses and heading back to the ranch. The ride home was quiet, all four of them processing the significance of what had just happened. When they arrived, Caleb helped Mara down from the wagon with a formality that made her smile despite herself. Everything had changed, and yet nothing felt fundamentally different from the day before. That evening, after the children were asleep, Caleb knocked softly on Mara's door. Their door now, technically, though they hadn't yet discussed the sleeping arrangements that marriage implied. She opened it to find him standing in the hallway, still in his wedding clothes, though he'd removed his jacket and tie. "Can we talk?" he asked. "Of course." Mara stepped aside to let him in, suddenly conscious of the intimacy of him being in her bedroom, even though they were now legally entitled to share space. Caleb remained standing near the door, maintaining careful distance. I want to be clear about expectations, about what this marriage means in practical terms. All right? I'm not expecting, that is, I won't assume that legal marriage automatically means. He struggled for words, his discomfort obvious. I won't push for physical intimacy until and unless you're comfortable with that development. This is a partnership first, and anything beyond that happens only if it feels right to both of us. Mara felt a rush of gratitude for his directness, his refusal to assume rights just because they'd exchanged vows. I appreciate that, and I want you to know that I'm not opposed to intimacy eventually, but I'd prefer we continue as we have been, building trust, learning each other, letting things develop naturally rather than forcing them according to some timeline. That works for me, Caleb said, relief evident in his voice. I'll keep using my room, you keep using this one, and we'll figure out the rest as we go. Agreed. Mara paused, then added carefully, but Caleb, I do want you to know that I'm glad we did this, that I feel safer and more hopeful than I have in years. You've given my children a home and a future, and that's not something I'll ever take lightly. You've given me back my life, Caleb said quietly, or at least reminded me that I have one worth living. That's a fair trade, I think. They stood there for a moment, married but still learning how to be married, committed but still figuring out what commitment meant in daily practice. Then Caleb nodded once, formal and courteous, and withdrew to his own room, leaving Mara to process the strange, wonderful reality that she was now Mara Mercer, that this ranch was legally her home, and that the lonely cowboy who'd hidden behind summer heat for 5 years had finally let her all the way in. The weeks that followed established new routines and deeper connections. Caleb filed the paperwork for the additional land claim, expanding their holdings and their future prospects. Thomas continued learning ranch work, growing stronger and more confident under Caleb's patient teaching. Lucy's chickens thrived, producing eggs that made breakfast a richer affair and gave the little girl enormous pride in her contribution to the household. And Mara and Caleb slowly, carefully, built something that looked remarkably like a real marriage. They worked together with increasing ease, their movements coordinated by familiarity and mutual respect. They made decisions jointly about the ranch, about the children, about their shared future. And gradually, almost imperceptibly, the careful distance they'd maintained began to close. It started with small things, Caleb's hand at the small of Mara's back as they navigated a crowded street in town, her fingers brushing his as they passed tools during repair work, the way they'd begun sitting closer together on the porch each evening until their shoulders touched. Nothing dramatic, nothing forced, just the natural progression of two people growing comfortable in each other's presence. The first time Caleb laughed, really laughed, not just the brief quirk of his mouth that passed for amusement, Mara nearly dropped the plate she was washing. It was late afternoon, and Lucy had been trying to teach the chickens to follow her in a line like ducklings. The hens, being chickens, had scattered in every direction except the one Lucy wanted, and the little girl's indignant scolding of the birds for their lack of cooperation was apparently too much for Caleb's composure. The sound that emerged from him was rusty, as if laughter was a skill he'd forgotten how to use properly. But it was genuine, warm, and it transformed his entire face. Thomas looked up from his book with surprise, and Mara felt her heart do something complicated in her chest. "You should do that more often," she said without thinking. "Do what?" "Laugh. You look about 10 years younger when you're not carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders." Caleb's expression sobered slightly, but there was warmth in his eyes. "Maybe I've got less to carry these days. You and the children shoulder some of that weight with me." "That's what families do," Mara replied. "Share the burden so no one person breaks under it." "Is that what we are now? A real family?" "I think we've been a real family for a while now. We just kept calling it a practical arrangement because that felt safer than admitting we'd started to care about each other." Caleb absorbed this, his ice-blue eyes searching her face. "And now? What do we call it now?" "Now we call it what it is. A marriage, a family, a life we're building together because we choose to, not because we have to." That night, for the first time, Caleb kissed Mara properly. Not a chaste peck on the cheek, but a real kiss, tentative at first and then deeper as she responded. It happened on the porch during their evening routine, the stars bright overhead and the night sounds of the ranch surrounding them. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing harder, and Caleb's hands were trembling slightly where they cupped her face. "I didn't think I could feel this again," he admitted, his voice raw with emotion. "Didn't think I deserved to feel this again." "You deserve every bit of happiness you can find," Mara told him fiercely. "Sarah wouldn't have wanted you to spend your life frozen in grief. She would have wanted you to live, to love again, to build something new." "How do you know?" "Because anyone who loved you enough to see past your outlaw history and marry you anyway would have been generous enough to want your future happiness, even if she couldn't be part of it." Caleb pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her in an embrace that felt less like passion and more like desperate gratitude. Mara held him, feeling the tremors running through his body as he finally let himself grieve properly and then let himself begin to heal. The turning point came 6 weeks after the wedding, when a late summer storm rolled through with unusual violence. Lightning split the sky, thunder shook the house, and rain hammered down with a force that suggested the drought might finally be breaking. Mara woke to the sound of the children crying and found both Thomas and Lucy huddled together in the hallway, frightened by the ferocity of the storm. She was gathering them close, preparing to bring them to her room, when Caleb emerged from his own room. He took in the situation at a glance and simply opened his arms. Both children ran to him without hesitation, and he scooped them up, Lucy in one arm, Thomas tucked against his side, with the practiced ease of a father who'd been doing this all their lives. "Just a storm," he said calmly, carrying them toward the main room. "Loud and dramatic, but the house is solid. We're safe." Mara followed, and they all ended up on the large sofa near the fireplace, the children sandwiched between the adults, while rain battered the windows and lightning illuminated the room in brief, stark flashes. Lucy burrowed against Caleb's chest, her thumb in her mouth despite being too old for that comfort. Thomas pressed close to his mother but kept one hand on Caleb's arm, as if anchoring himself to both parents. "Pa used to tell us stories during storms," Thomas said quietly. "Said it helped us remember that storms always pass and the sun always comes back." "Smart man," Caleb replied. "What kind of stories?" "About brave people doing hard things, knights and cowboys and pioneers, people who were scared but did the right thing anyway." "I think I can manage that." Caleb shifted slightly, getting more comfortable, his arms secure around both children. "Let me tell you about the first winter I spent in this house, before your mother came along. It was just me and my horse, and we got snowed in for 3 weeks straight. Food ran low, water froze, and I started wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake trying to build a life out here alone." His voice was low and steady, the story equal parts honest and reassuring. Mara watched him as he spoke, saw how naturally he'd folded these children into his heart, how the walls he'd built so carefully had come down piece by piece until there was nothing left but a man who'd remembered how to be fully human. The storm raged outside, but inside the house was warm and safe, filled with the sound of Caleb's voice and the children's gradually steadying breaths. By the time the storm passed, both Thomas and Lucy were asleep, sprawled across their parents with the boneless trust of children who knew they were protected. "We should put them to bed," Mara whispered, but made no move to disturb the peaceful scene. "In a minute," Caleb replied, equally quiet. His hand found hers in the dim light, their fingers interlacing with practiced ease. "I just want to remember this moment, this feeling of being exactly where I'm supposed to be." "Me too," Mara agreed, squeezing his hand gently. They sat there until the storm was just distant thunder, until the rain gentled to a soft patter, until the house settled back into its nighttime quiet. And when they finally carried the children to bed and returned to their separate rooms, something fundamental had shifted. The careful distance they'd maintained, the protective walls they'd both erected around their hearts. All of it had dissolved in the warmth of shared family life. 3 months after the wedding, as autumn began painting the landscape in shades of gold and orange, Mara woke to find Caleb's side of the bed warm. Not his bed in his room, but the bed they'd been sharing for the past month, ever since they'd stopped pretending that their practical arrangement hadn't transformed into something far deeper. She stretched lazily, hearing the sounds of him moving around the kitchen, probably making coffee before heading out for morning chores. But when she emerged, dressed and ready to start breakfast, she found something unexpected. The kitchen table was set with care, and Caleb stood at the stove managing what appeared to be an attempt at pancakes. Thomas and Lucy were already at the table, clearly having been sworn to secrecy based on their poorly suppressed grins. "What's all this?" Mara asked, surprised and touched. "I noticed that you're always the one making breakfast," Caleb said, not turning from the stove. "Thought maybe you deserved a morning where someone took care of you instead." The pancakes were slightly burned and definitely lopsided, but they were made with care and served with obvious pride. Mara sat down, absurdly close to tears, and let her family fuss over her. Lucy poured juice with concentrated effort, Thomas distributed butter and syrup, and Caleb presented his culinary efforts with the nervous pride of someone who'd stepped far outside his comfort zone. "They're perfect," Mara said, and meant it completely. "They're terrible," Caleb corrected with unusual humor. "But they're made with good intentions, which has to count for something." After breakfast, after the children had been sent to complete their morning chores, Caleb pulled Mara aside with an expression that suggested he had something important to say. "I've been thinking," he started, then paused as if the words were difficult. "About expanding the house, adding on a proper bedroom for Thomas, maybe a separate room for Lucy. They're getting older, and they deserve their own space." "That's thoughtful," Mara agreed, "though it would be expensive. The ranch is doing well, better than it has in years. The additional land I claimed is good grazing, and cattle prices are strong." Caleb's hand found hers, their fingers interlacing automatically. "But more than that, I want to invest in our future, in building something permanent that reflects the family we've become." The family we've become," Mara repeated softly. "I like the sound of that." "So do I." Caleb pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her waist. "I love you, Mara. I didn't think I'd ever say those words again, didn't think I was capable of feeling them. But I do. I love you, and I love those children, and I love the life we're building together." Mara felt tears spill over, but they were good tears, healing tears. "I love you too, and I'm so grateful you took a chance on us, that you let me breach those walls you'd built so carefully." "Best decision I ever made," Caleb said, and kissed her with a tenderness that still managed to set her heart racing. "Well, second best. First best was saying yes when a desperate woman called out my name in the middle of Main Street and asked me if I wanted to stop hiding behind the summer heat. That was rather bold of me. That was exactly what I needed." Caleb rested his forehead against hers, his breath warm on her face. "You saved my life, Mara. Not in some romantic, dramatic way, but in the real, everyday way that matters. You reminded me that survival isn't the same as living, and that opening your heart is worth the risk of it breaking." Outside, they could hear Lucy talking to the chickens, her voice high and cheerful as she conducted her morning routine. Thomas emerged from the barn, leading Caleb's horse for the day's work, moving with the confidence of a boy who'd found his place in the world. The autumn sun painted everything golden, and the air held the promise of rain that might finally, truly, break the long drought. Caleb and Mara stood in the doorway of their home, truly their home now, built on more than legal documents and practical arrangements, and watched their children navigate their morning tasks with practiced ease. The ranch thrived around them, evidence of hard work and careful stewardship. The house would soon expand to accommodate their growing family, and the future stretched ahead, uncertain but no longer frightening, because they would face it together. "Thank you," Caleb said quietly, "for not giving up on me, for seeing past the walls and the grief and the stubborn isolation to whatever was still worth saving underneath." "Thank you," Mara replied, "for being brave enough to let us in, for choosing life over survival, for becoming the man my children needed and the partner I'd stopped believing I could find." They stood together, hands clasped and hearts intertwined, as the Wyoming sun climbed higher and the endless summer, the season that had seen a broken cowboy learn to live again, finally, mercifully, began its gentle transition into autumn. The heat would return next year as it always did, but Caleb Mercer would no longer hide behind it, no longer use it as an excuse to remain frozen in solitude. He had a family now, a wife who challenged him and supported him in equal measure, children who looked to him for guidance and gave him purpose. A home filled with laughter and arguments, and the messy, beautiful reality of people who loved each other learning to live together. The cowboy who'd hidden behind the heat had finally stepped into the warmth of human connection and discovered that it was far more sustaining than any amount of isolation could ever be. The summer that had begun with desperate questions in a dusty street had transformed into a season of second chances, of walls coming down, of frozen hearts remembering how to beat. And as the first cool breeze of autumn whispered across the ranch, carrying the promise of rain and renewal, Caleb pulled his family close and understood with absolute clarity that he'd finally found what he'd been searching for all along. Not rescue, not romance, but something far more valuable, a reason to keep living that was stronger than any reason to hide. They were home. They were whole. They were, despite all odds and past pain, genuinely happy. And that was more than enough. That was everything.